This week, it won't be, we won't be talking about any additional saints. I'm going to start that up starting next week. But this week, I want to talk about four errors. Four errors, three of which I made and one of which Kenneth made. And I want to talk about this because it's important to remind ourselves, right? Kenneth doesn't want to be anybody's guru. I don't want to be anybody's guru. I'm not a teacher. I'm just a fellow student like the rest of you. The fact that I've been reading Kenneth longer than most of you, but not all of you. Hi, Donald. It doesn't mean that I'm going to be always right about things. And the whole point, as Kenneth makes this point over and over and over, the whole point of philosophy is to use the techniques not against others to win arguments. That's mere sophistry. It's to use them against yourself. It's to use them against your character, to get leverage on your character so that you can break down the boundaries that are blocking you from learning and create new possibilities to see the world as closer to the way it actually is. Less the way that would please our appetites, less the way that would please our ideologies, and more the way that things actually are. And as the Greeks make the point over and over, to be mortal is not just to die, but also that your creative works die, which is a great frustration because that would have been a great consolation if they could just live on. But no, they die too eventually. But worst of all, the Greeks said, the worst thing about being mortal is that we're so stupid. So we don't live long enough. We don't see enough of the world. It's so easy to make mistakes of perspective because we're standing in one limited part of the cosmos, only looking from there. We miss almost everything. We only catch the things that come nearby. And I was arguing with my dad yesterday on a walk around Green Lake. He's an intellectual rationalist. Stephen would have a blast arguing with my dad. And he has this, as Stephen points out, intellectuals do, enormous faith in human reason. And he thinks that I'm just being incredibly obscurantist by suggesting that the human mind isn't capable of all things. And he eventually backpedaled a little bit. But I said, look, even when it comes to vision, which is when it comes to the senses is one of our strongest suits, right? I mean, we have very good vision. We still see a tiny, teeny, tiny sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum, right? Almost all of it, the radio waves, the infrared, the ultraviolet, gamma rays, all that stuff's invisible to us. It's all electromagnetic and it's all right there in our presence, and we miss it. So not only are we only looking for one perspective, we're only getting a limited slice of what's going on in the world. So for these and other reasons, the Greeks said, it's always important to recognize that to be Homo sapiens is to be an idiot. And by idiot, we don't mean a dummy. That's the modern definition. Idiota, one's own. We mean the particular flaw we have is that we overprivilege our perspective, our feelings, our appetites, our ideologies and ideas. And we undervalue the ideas and appetites and privileges and insights of everybody else in the world, right? That's because they're not ours, and ours just smell right to us, and everybody else's smells wrong. We have an easier time picking away at other people's arguments than at our own. But that's what philosophy is for, is to fix that problem, to point us at ourselves, to get the Archimedean standpoint, says Kenneth Smith. He quotes Kafka. He was permitted to attain the Archimedean standpoint on the condition that he use it against himself. Archimedes said, give me the right place to stand and a long enough lever and I could move the entire world. That's what Kafka is referring to, right? So how do you move your own ideologies? How do you move your own character enough to break out of the shell and the trap and the labyrinth that is our preconceptions and our limited experience?
This is something Kafka actually said.
Yes, it's in one of his notebooks.
Okay.
It's one of the Blue Octavo notebooks. On another day, if you caught me when my brain was more by that topic, I could even cite which one it is. Kenneth cites it in one of his books. So this is the idea. This is what philosophy is for. And as an exercise in philosophy, therefore, I'm now going to start out today by sharing with you 4 mistakes, one of which is Kenneth's and 3 of which are mine. Right? And this is a necessary correction because everything that we're saying is recorded. It all goes up on YouTube. And it's there for in perpetuity, and other people will watch those videos and they will read them and think, oh, this is what they really think. But we have the same problem that Nietzsche had. which is, as Nietzsche learned more, he changed his mind. He wrote later books that contradicted the earlier books because he decided he was wrong in his earlier books. But people still quote the earlier books as though that represents what Nietzsche believes in some sort of eternal Platonic way, right? We're all on a journey of growth and we all have to learn things. So let's start with Kenneth's error. Kenneth loves a quote out of Oedipus Tyrannus called, and the quote is, "The unheeded thing escapes." The unheeded thing escapes, from Oedipus Tyrannus. And it's a line said by a character in the play. And it's a reference to Heraclitus's famous fragment that says, Homer was mistaken because he failed to learn the lesson of the children when they told him he failed to learn the lesson of the children removing lice from themselves when they told him, what we grasp we leave behind, but what we fail to grasp we take away with us. The unheeded thing escapes, right? The parts of yourself you haven't examined contain the errors that are going to stick with you for the rest of your life. This is why gnosis out and know thyself is the centerpiece of ancient Greek philosophy and religion. You have to go digging, you have to go exploring, and you have to find the errors that are in your head. Because if you find them,
surely ignorance is bliss.
Surely ignorance is bliss. Yes, yes. You know, if finding that you have a mistake and talking about it openly gives you, if you've got trauma that came out of your elementary school years associated with that, being wrong means getting a bad grade. It means, the teacher doesn't call on you anymore. They give you, it's lots of people come out of this experience with trauma and thinking, well, the most important thing is that I never get caught being wrong. And if I never catch myself being wrong, I can fantasize that I'm always right. Isn't that great? So now I can just walk around proudly proclaiming my nonsense to everybody around me and refusing to ever question it. But the Greeks say no, on the contrary. The way that you liberate yourself, the way that you create free will, the way that you become not just a symptom of your experiences, but an actual individual, is by digging through your character, finding the major problems in it, and then cultivating that character to compensate for those problems. And that's a duty and a responsibility. This is why Kenneth loves this quote, "The unheeded thing escapes." So you have to pay attention, close attention, to what's going on around you and within you, to the nature around you and to the nature within you. This is what you learn more from failure than success. That's exactly right, Jason. That's the Greek concept in a nutshell. You want to find those errors so that you can learn from them. So again, Heraclitus talks about that we are essentially amphibious creatures. We are not solitary individuals moving through a universe. We are trapped between two infinities. There is the nature around us, which is bigger than we are, but there's also the nature within us, which is also bigger than we are, paradoxically, because we could spend an entire life trying to figure out who the hell we are and what makes us tick and still not get all of the major points of what's going on in there. And you have to explore them both, and both of them are lawful. They have their own laws of development, their own architecture. They have to be examined. This is why Kenneth likes this quote so much, is because it both applies to paying attention to the world around you, and it has to do with paying attention to the world inside of you. And at the moment when this line appears at Oedipus Tyrannus, it means both things at the same time. But Oedipus thinks it only means the outer thing. So Oedipus keeps pursuing the mystery of the miasma in Thebes and what's causing it. And he misses that the other implication is he has failed to look inside himself and figure out who he is and where he came from. And if he did that part, we know on the second reading, if he had done that part, the mystery of the miasma could have been solved long ago. But that's the one place he's not looking. He thinks that part doesn't matter. All right, so the error is that Kenneth attributes this to Tiresias, because that looks like a little bit of wisdom literature right there. The unheeded thing escapes. This is profound. It's Heraclitean in its gnomic condensation, its density. But it's not Tiresias who says it. It's Cleon. It's the brother of Jocasta who says this, which makes it all the more remarkable, because Cleon is not, he's not a medium passing on the wisdom of the gods. He's just a guy making an observation that at that particular moment happens to be far more profound than Cleon thinks it is. And that's why Kenneth always gets this quote wrong and attributes it to Tiresias. He did it in writing in one of his books. He actually put it in writing that this was Tiresias. And, Kenneth, like any of us, will make mistakes. This is a mistake. When I eventually do a reprinting of that book, I'll put a footnote in and say, we all make mistakes. And this is far from the only one he'll make. He often makes them on quotes because he carries around a giant volume in his head of huge numbers of fragments and quotes and references. And you know how it is. The human mind, can't be trusted. And so from time to time, you're not going to quite remember who said which thing, or you won't get the quote quite right. So that's him. And then the next three will be me. But first, I'm going to call on the questions that we have. And we'll start with Phil. What's on your mind, Phil? Come off mute.
The way you explain that almost seems like there's a contrast between Eastern and Western religion. Because it seems to me the Eastern religion is to get your mind straight, like the Buddha. Go to go to a cave and meditate on yourself before you get into philosophy. I mean, almost seems like not only the Buddha, but in some ways, Socrates seemed to be that way, right? Because he doesn't know, and he's trying to figure it out. So was Socrates a philosopher? Was he a pre-philosopher? Was it Plato who actually began philosophy? Because it seemed to me that pre-Socratics were edging toward that, but they hadn't gotten into philosophy itself. So to start off right from the beginning, that Plato is the guy who established that, it seems to me you're jumping the gun, isn't it? Because you haven't got it straight to begin with within yourself. At least Socrates didn't do that. He was willing to talk about it. And then he was really, in a funny way, because he lived in the world and he doesn't know, he's going to settle with the laws despite the fact they're going to kill him. He could have left. So, in a sense, he had to obey something that's within existence rather than say, well, wait a minute, wait a minute, I'm innocent, right? Because you have to follow the external laws finally as well, because since you don't know, you have to be committed to something, and that's the best you could do is that I believe in Athens. I'm
Yeah.
going to die rather than go somewhere else where I'm free to go if I want. I could go to the cave and meditate some more.
Yeah.
So that's a very interesting thing to, in a sense, both open up with Plato, but also almost pin pin the blame on him to begin with, which is very interesting.
Yes.
That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, when we get through my three mistakes, you're right. We're going to dive into chapter 7, and it opens with Plato. And you're right about the pivotal point of Plato there. Everybody calls the folks before Plato the pre-Socratics, but not Nietzsche. Nietzsche's book on the pre-Socratic philosophers is called the pre-Platonic philosophers, because he lumps in Socrates with the earlier guys, which is an interesting choice on his part. And it kind of underscores that idea that starting with Plato, we have vast tracts of the material that the philosopher wrote. But before Plato, all we've got mostly are fragments. And sometimes they're longer fragments, but we don't have a lot. And there is a way in which Plato and Aristotle and others who follow are really focused on the logos side of philosophy. They really want to systematize and document. And the guys before are more like, you're lucky I say anything at all. It's like, it's not my job to try to represent all of the cosmos to you. I'm lucky I've got what I consider to be several reasonable points of wisdom to rub together, and I'm not going to overreach. Uh, there's interesting things that happen there. In the case of Socrates, it's a point that Xenophanes makes that Plato doesn't make so well, is that, as Xenophanes says, at any time Socrates knew exactly what he had to say to not be executed. It wasn't not only was it not a foregone conclusion that they wanted to execute him, they didn't want to execute him. He knew what he had to say. And what he had to say was just what anybody except him would say in that situation, which is, yeah, you're right. My depiction of the daimon is not literally. I'm not claiming that that's the religious truth, right? It's a metaphor. That's all he had to say. But he insisted, no, my daimon actually works that way. And they're like, okay, that's no, you got to go. And the reason that he wouldn't say it is not because we like to say it's he died for philosophy, but it wasn't so simple as that. It was that, remember, we're in the midst of the Peloponnesian War, and that was brought on by having greed heads voting, and the greed heads all voted for the war. They all said, let's go, let's not only do we need to defeat Sparta, let's then create a giant naval expedition and sail off to Syracuse, because we're going to conquer the entire Western Mediterranean, and then we'll control trade in both halves of the Mediterranean. We'll be so rich, right? These are traders and bankers and craftsmen, and they want to be rich. They want to control all the trade of the Mediterranean. There, as Thucydides says in the history of the Peloponnesian War, there's a character flaw in Athens. Athens' character has changed from just a few generations ago, and now it's greedy and overreaching. All of the flaws of an Agamemnon play are present in the behavior of the electorate. And Socrates sees that. I mean, Aristotle and Plato see it too. He sees it, and he asks himself, whether it's on the page in Plato or not, he asks himself, what can an Aristos do under these circumstances to fix what's sick in Athens? How can I get the attention of the people and make them think again about kind of the core value system that got us where we were originally, so that maybe they give up this craziness and go back to a life of virtue. And one of the things that he sees is people have become so focused on their fears and their hopes and their appetites and their calculations that they've forgotten the heroic life. So the Greeks have this ethos of not fearing death. It comes from being a conquering warrior people. The Indo-Europeans invade Europe from the Caucasus Mountains. They invade and conquer Europe, and the Hellenes, the ancestors of the Athenians, were just like that. They prided themselves on their warrior ethos. They saw an Aristos as a warrior above all else. And the defining characteristic they see of the difference between an Aristos and a slave or doulos is that the doulos fears death enough that you can enslave him. But the Aristos does not fear death. He scoffs at death. He says, I will always do the right thing, whether I live or die. So the important thing is that as a people, we succeed. And that might require me to die. And I'm willing to do that because I'm not afraid. And that's what marks me as an Aristos. This is what he thinks. And other people famously are lighting themselves on fire or executing themselves publicly, by the way, around the same period in these spectacles designed to try to remind people, don't be so greedy, don't be so selfish, don't be so focused on your appetites. Remember who you are. You're a warrior people. And so Socrates says, I'm so not afraid of death that I'm willing to die even over a small point of verbiage. Right? I'm willing to die to show you that the details of philosophy matter to me more than my life does. And by illustrating that, okay, it's nice that that's, making a point for philosophy, which is how moderns read it. But more importantly, it's making a point that Athens has collapsed morally, and he's trying to remind them of who they used to be. And the greatest reminder he can possibly give is to make them go ahead with this farce of a state trial and execute him, even though at any moment he could walk away from it. So I just think that's one of the things that Kenneth and some others have pointed out to me that I didn't know originally about Socrates. And I always thought it was interesting that Socrates was not doing this for the reasons we assume. I mean, they're in there, but they're not the primary reasons. It was part of the same movement of people offing themselves in public as a way to say, there are worse things than dying. And Diogenes, of course, is famous for all the stunts he pulls just a generation later. It's like, what do I have to do to nudge you people to wake up and remember who you used to be? Anyway, thank you, Phil. I appreciate it. Good points. Ginny, come on. Yeah, you're off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah. I'm curious. So have you read all of the plays written by Sophocles and Aeschylus and no?
No.
Because you sure sound like you have, and I'm always very impressed by people who read these plays who were not theater majors. I read them because I had to, because I was a theater major, you know. And when people talk about like Oedipus the King, for example, and Tiresias and America, oh my God! I mean, they're just some people are just amazing what they've read.
I just
So,
chew a
but
lot.
Tiresias does warn Oedipus during the play, you know,
He
that,
does.
yeah, okay.
Yeah. Tiresias plays a major role in the play,
Yeah.
but he doesn't say this particular line. That's Cleon. Where's it
Mhm.
Creon? Oh, I'm doing it again.
The King
Damn
Creon.
it.
Yeah.
It's Creon.
Creon, yeah.
Thank you. Hey, Creon. Cleon is the guy in the Peloponnesian War. Creon is the guy in Oedipus Tyrannus. There. Any chance that I was wowing you with my scholarship? I'm just the human mind, man. You can't trust it.
Well,
So
well, you're still amazing. Okay. All right.
So yeah, I'm working my way through the plays one at a time slowly because I spent a lot of time chewing them over. So right now I'm still chewing over the Agamemnon because I love what Cornford said about it in his book Thucydides Mythhistoricus. And so I'm really still digesting that whole concept of the daimones and how they affect the character and phylactos versus aphylactos, which by the way we're going to talk about next after I call on Stephen. Speaking of which, hey Stephen, how you doing? Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, thank you very much, Rick. Yeah, I'm doing okay, I imagine. I was just going to say this little bits about how a culture declines sort of grabbed me lately. And it does seem to be the view that a culture has finer values, for example, if it expresses a philosophical or religious concept. But in with that, the Greeks seem to have also the warrior culture, the heroic idea, that all these aspects of culture look to something higher. You know, some people would be opposed to the warrior culture, but as far as the Greeks were concerned, there was the qualities of self-sacrifice and aiming at something higher than yourself, even in the warrior culture. This is a philosopher giving a talk, and he was pointing out, of course, that the trouble with democracy, which was viewed negatively, much to our shock, is that it was a culture which worshipped the appetite, the lower aspects of man. And our culture, even though it's been said, even though the ancient Greeks pointed this out, it's lost on most modern people. It's lost on this modern Western culture that worships democracy. Yay, democracy. And we've reached a point now that all the leaders of democracy can talk about is at the buck. Even when I was a kid, I'd say, oh, it's nice to go home at Christmas and be with your family and respect some value higher than your own belly button. But then the 80s came along and Gordon Gekko, greed is good. And you look at the modern culture and that's the absolute height, is giving everybody the good life, which is an ever-changing parameter. And the end is, of course, in democracy, people will vote themselves more things that please their appetite. That's the ultimate way of pleasing the public. And the end is you get a tyrant. So the modern West, particularly America, the modern realm of the Anglo-Saxons has reached that point. They followed the recipe perfectly. And they're not even aware they're doing it, even though if they bothered to look, it's already been written down what the problem is. Their God is the stomach, as with the one-eyed Titans. I forget the name of the particular race of
Cyclops.
monsters. The
Cyclops.
Cyclops, yeah.
Polyphemus.
and they can't figure out why they've got a tyrant. The public has created the tyrant. They blame the tyrant, but they should best be blaming themselves. Also, I was just wondering if you could expand a bit on that bit about Socrates having an issue that he wasn't going to bow down to. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, as usual, you say a lot of very interesting things there. And as we'll see when we get to my first error, you play a prominent part in the correction. So we'll talk about that too. But let's start with democracy being a bad thing. Here is a Wikipedia article, and this part of it is quite good. For anybody who hasn't read Aristotle's The Politics or hasn't read a good translation of it, this section of this webpage about Aristotle's Politics is very good. And this is where he's got the table and the diagrams that show the 6 different forms of government, which is really 3 forms of government, but once in a good form and once in a bad form, according to the table. But what we know from our discussions is what the Wikipedia authors don't understand is that the good form isn't just, subjectively good. He's talking about sophrosyne. And the bad form is he's talking about the absence of sophrosyne. And so, as you say, Stephen, democracy is in the lower right of that table. It's the bad form of the rule of the many, which means the rule by people who lack sophrosyne. And they can lack sophrosyne. They could be pulled by either of 2 major, as we know from Kenneth Smith's work and Hannah Arendt's and the others, they could be pulled by either of 2 major traps of the mind, either by their appetites and parochial experiences and feelings on the one hand, in which case they're douloi, or slaves. Or on the other hand, they could be pulled away from sophrosyne by their ideologies and their education and their training, right? The intellectual problem that you often point out, in which case they're banausoi. And either of those can act as a trap to pull people away from sophrosyne. It's something that doesn't happen to other organisms. And again, we're going to talk about this in a moment. But it doesn't happen to other organisms. It only happens to us. And it is the price that we pay for our intelligence and creativity and flexibility and adaptability. Exactly the same thing that makes us able to have all those good things gives us the worst possible bad thing, which is that we're the only organism that lacks the compass in the brain that points us strongly in the direction of health and vitality. The health and vitality of ourselves as individuals, the health and vitality of our neighbors and our family and the people we care about and our species, but also the health and vitality of the whole ecosystem. What the cheetah does to the gazelle, it does in a way that's good for the gazelles as well as for the cheetah. And that is the sophrosyne in action. But what we do as human beings rarely has that quality of health. And it has to be struggled for. And that's what philosophy to the Greeks means, is that you've done that struggle to try to cobble together a weak simulation of the sophrosyne that comes naturally to every other organism. And if you've done that work, and more importantly, if you know you have the problem, if you know that as a Homo sapiens, you fail to see where health and vitality lies, and that it's going to be a struggle, then you're competent to govern, relatively speaking. But if you don't question yourself, if you don't struggle against your character, if you don't try to cultivate it into something better, if you don't pit your gnosis against your noesis so that you don't trust either one of them, and you try to use them against each other with the evidence of the world, as Phil says, equivocating between what's inside our mind and what's out in the world to try to figure out where health and vitality lies. If you do those things, then you might have the potential to govern. If you don't do those things, then you are the bad form from this table. And so the word that I can never remember, he says tyranny is the non-sophrosyne form of rule by a single person. Monarchy is the sophrosyne form, the good form of rule by one person. He says better, and this reinforces Stephen's point, it is better to be ruled by one dude who's got sophrosyne than to have a democracy in which nobody has sophrosyne. Because simply adding up the votes isn't going to create sophrosyne through some magic trick. Sophrosyne is its own thing. You can't put a bunch of greedy people together and have them vote and magically have them vote for something healthy. That's not going to happen. They're going to vote for something greedy because that's who they are. So again, he says the bad form of rule by a few is oligarchy. The good form of rule by a few is aristocracy, which, containing aristos means something radically different to the Greeks than it meant to us.
Well, for modern people, democracy means getting everything we want without any restraint.
That's right. And that's the third line in the table. Democracy is the bad form of rule by the many. Democracy means a whole bunch of people who don't have sophrosune get together and arm wrestle over who gets their will. Right? Majority rule doesn't guarantee health and vitality. Minority rights also doesn't guarantee health and vitality. Moderns think the epitome of enlightened democracy is that we don't just allow mobocracy, but we also protect minority rights. But the minority could also lack sophrosune. Aristotle says, if you're not talking about whether people have or lack sophrosune, what the hell are you talking about? It's the heart of governance. Counting the number of people voting is like at most a trivial thing by comparison. You want everybody who's got sophrosune in on the decision. And everybody who doesn't have sophrosune, you don't want them in on the decision. Because they're just going to vote for their appetites or their ideologies. They can't help themselves. They haven't individuated yet. If you put a bunch of tape recorders in a room and press play on them, they just play back whatever's on them. They're not actually governing, and they're not actually detecting the direction of health. So he says the healthy form, and this, by the way, anybody who's watched the recordings on YouTube will know, I always forget this term. I remember the other 5, and I always forget the 6th. So I guess I have 4 mistakes today to correct, and this is the 4th mistake. He's got 2 different terms that mean the good form of rule by the many. And by the good form, we mean rule by a many who have sophrosune. And one of them he uses is timocracy, which is based on time, which is a really interesting term, which we'll talk about sometime. But I want to focus on the other term, which is polity, P-O-L-I-T-Y, polity. The moderns occasionally use the term polity, but we don't mean anything like what Aristotle meant. What he meant, and this goes to something that we said multiple times, and that Kenneth implies, although I can't remember if he actually says it. He says, if you don't have a polis, you can't have politics. Whatever it is moderns have, it isn't politics. They can call it politics till the cows come home. That doesn't make it politics. Not even if it's the one thing all of us agree on and we get a vote of 8 billion to nothing and it all says, yes, what we're doing is politics, we're still wrong. It doesn't make it politics. To be politics, you have to have a polis. And what characterizes the polis is that you have solidarity. You weave together multiple tribes and multiple clans and multiple peoples. And the weaving is, we know that we have a better chance of surviving together than if we let ourselves be pulled apart to pieces. We're going to pull ourselves together into a cosmos, not just a mob, but an actual organism. So there will be each of us as separate organisms, but there will also be the superorganism that we create together. And its health and vitality is as precious to us as our own. Not more precious, not less precious. It's a dialectic. They both matter. And this, again, is something the Greeks are better at than moderns are. We're often saying, well, you can't sacrifice 100 people to save one life. It's like, well, now you're doing math with human beings. That's stupid. And there are also people who say, well, yeah, the one person has to take care of himself. Screw the 100. You get the individualists. They take the other extreme. The one matters, not the many. And the Greeks say, both of you are stupid. You have to come up with a way that works most of the time for both the individual and the collective. That's the polis. And anything less than that isn't a polis. And the art of governing such an organism of humanity is called politics. And anything that isn't that, such as I just want to go in and get my, like Stephen points out, if you just go in and vote for your appetites, that's not politics. No matter how many levers you pull, no matter how many boxes you check, it's not politics. It's some ersatz artificial saccharin substitute for politics. It's filling the same receptors and making us feel like grown-ups while not actually serving human needs and human health. And Aristotle says, you'd have to be an idiot not to make this distinction. How many people are voting is all well and good, but what are they voting for? Are they voting for sophrosune or not? No other question comes close to mattering to that one. And yet moderns never ask it because we don't even have the word or the concept. So thank you, Stephen. I mean, you've really put your finger on a critical issue here.
Yeah, to me, I look at all the people that are talking about democracy and they don't know history.
Right.
And I would point out to them, they're looking backwards. They're
Yeah.
looking at what was or appeared to be was, and they think that's going to go on forever. You know, we're having a really good time. 50 years ago, it was magnificent. Oh, this has to be the new normal. Nothing
Yes.
less will do. And I don't know if I want to labour you too much, but this point that you were making about Socrates, that he wasn't going to give up a certain principle.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I missed that one. Yeah. Yeah, let me respond to that because you asked me to. So yeah, the principle in question is, according to the Greek, Cornford, F.M. Cornford in From Religion to Philosophy says that the oldest stratum of Greek religion that we can detect, other than the things that Gilbert Murray talks about in Five Stages of Greek Religion, but he says the oldest, really still active, powerful stratum of Greek religion is not the Olympian gods. It's not polytheism per se. It's the daimon religion. And the daimon religion is the idea that everything has its soul. And this is one of the, Thales had three theorems, and one of them is that everything is alive and ensouled. Right? To treat things as inanimate things is to grossly misunderstand their role in the world. Even what you identify as dead material for you to manipulate has its rules. You can't manipulate clay the same way you manipulate wood. You
We
can't.
have a trace of anism here.
Yeah, yeah. It's a highly sophisticated form of animism, and it goes into human beings and says that, everything has its nature. Its nature is lawful. Its nature is a fountain of order. Its nature is an organism itself that is growing and changing and learning. And as it grows and changes and learns, that organism within us, our nature, affects what choices we're able to make. It shapes our actions and our thoughts and our feelings. And that is it rules over us like a daimon. This is why Heraclitus says ethos anthropoi daimon. Man's character is his daimon. It's a little god over him that has ultimate authority over what we're able to do and what we're able to say. So, but central to this idea is that the daimon is invisible and inaudible. It is the hidden harmony is better than the obvious, says Heraclitus, and that goes to the heart of this idea, that harmonious fountain of order within us, that lawful structure within us that's generating our choices, is not visible to us. We can't hear it, we can't see it. It's not a person. It doesn't talk to us. It's deeper than that. Personhood couldn't exist without this sort of thing. It's at a more fundamental, it's at the level of ananke, necessity, or the fates. It's not at the level of somebody you could talk to. But Socrates says in Plato's dialogues, and obviously not just in the dialogues, but in Athens, Socrates says, yeah, me and my daimon were having a chat the other day. And all over Athens, they're going, no, no. If you were chatting with something, it was not your daimon, because nobody can chat with their daimon. That is that fundamental stratum. It is deeper than language. It's deeper than personality. And you got to stop confused. And Socrates has been running around capturing the attention of the youth of Athens, and they're following him around like a guru, and they're being influenced by his ideas. And some of them are running off to become sophists. And Athens is saying the sophists are ruining Athens. The sophists got us into this fucking war. You've got to stop it, Socrates. You've got to stop misleading these kids and making them grow up to be these people who think, I know, let's just sail off to Syracuse.
Quite the Three Stooges. Ah, a wise guy.
Wise guy, eh? Yes. And so they're saying, we're asking you to stop it. And you could just start with the idea that your daimon's not some dude you have conversations with. And Socrates is saying, no, I'm not going to recant. I'm not going to recant because I'm just asking questions, man. He's the ultimate Hellenic sea lion. Don't mind me. I don't have any opinions. I'm just asking questions. And I'm not going to say that I'm doing something wrong by doing that. So we're like, okay, you got to go. We can't have any more sophists. And of course that backfires on them because, after Socrates, there are far more sophists than there were before Socrates. So it's like killing him did not solve Athens's problems.
Well, it would have made them satisfied that they had failed, they'd lost the war,
Yeah.
and they need to find people to blame for the loss.
I can't remember the timing of his execution. I can't remember if it's after the war or during the war.
After the war.
Okay.
About 2 years after the war had ended, 3 or 2 years.
Okay. So yeah, it sounds like scapegoating, doesn't it? Yeah.
Well, of course, recalling that Socrates at one point had been a pre-Socratic.
Right. Right.
He'd followed the normal path of speculating about nature.
Yeah.
And there were too many in that business, I assume, and he thought, I'll have to find a new line of work. I'll look into the inner nature
Yes.
rather than the outer nature,
Yes.
which is something that was normally the role of the mysteries. So
Yes.
he was offending the mysteries possibly as well.
For
He was
sure.
taking their business.
For sure.
People
And
wander around asking questions about themselves, which was strictly something you went to the mysteries to do. Well,
yes,
he was an unlicensed doctor.
that's
Only
right.
the mysteries are the licensed doctors to solve your mental problems.
And you're right that the religious cults were licensed. Specific families in each polis owned the right to carry out the rituals of their particular cult. So Heraclitus's family in Ephesus had the right to the Eleusinian mysteries, and nobody else was allowed to do it. So I think you're onto something there. The only caveat I'd add to it is that the characterization that the pre-Socratics were more concerned with the outer world, that's the modern interpretation of the pre-Socratics, but it doesn't quite hold up because you can see with when Thales is saying that everything is water, it satisfies that pattern you're describing. But Thales then goes on to say that everything is full of souls and full of gods. And when he's saying that, he's now talking about the inner nature, right? The soul is the psyche with the ethos and that functions as a daimon.
This is a time of transition. This is the axial age.
Yes.
And we were transiting we're coming to a culture that we can understand, a rational culture.
Yes.
But the culture that preceded it is the one that's difficult for us to understand.
That's right.
This was the culture of the mysteries.
That's
This
right.
was the culture before skepticism. If skepticism appeared before this time, they said, oh, you're sick, you need a doctor, come to the mysteries. We'll cure you of skepticism.
That's right. Here,
And
have
look
this
what
exciting
happens.
drink. Don't ask
They
what's in it.
let Socrates go, and a few centuries later, the whole culture is full of skeptics.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I think it was the book Supernatural that talked about the role of entheogens, hallucinogens that made you see God, in world religion, really up until surprisingly late. And one of the things that they said is, yeah, the Greeks routinely used hallucinogens in their mystery religions. And if you want to know, just look at the vases. You'll see these depictions of scenes of Theseus and the Minotaur, and then down in the corner is a little mushroom. There's little mushrooms all over those vases. I mean, they're everywhere. It's like, yeah, man, I had a drink with a magic mushroom and I totally saw the Minotaur in the labyrinth. Believe you me. They were,
To the more ancient culture, a skeptic is a person with a hammer
yeah,
hitting themselves in the head and
that's right.
saying, I feel pain.
That's right. And the thing about these powerful hallucinogens like entheogens is that they really break up compartmentalization in the brain. And I'm basing this on reading, not on experience. Given my background, I can't dabble with this stuff, but I've read about it a lot, and it's hard to maintain your rigid noetic compartmentalizations in the face of these entheogens, which just cut right across the mind with the power of your emotional limbic system. So, for example, on the Navajo reservation, from time to time, In the Native American church, they'll use peyote. And one of the things that they use it for in the ritual, aside from it being a religious ritual, is that they'll bring alcoholic members of their family, people who nothing has worked for, and they'll bring them into the ritual and make them go through the religious mystery ritual with peyote. And their rate of breaking alcoholism, getting people free of it, using peyote in that particular context, is like 10 times as effective as AA. I mean, I'm citing this from a friend of mine who's a Navajo, who this was done for him to get him to stop being an alcoholic, and then he became a priest in the Native American church and began using it with his relatives who were still in the bottle, and they got free of it using the peyote as well. And what that's showing is the power of these entheogens to break habits, and habits are very, very central to the intellectual brain. You know, the learning the steps of systematic logic and mathematics, and what you have to go through to climb as a craftsman. All of this stuff is the development of habits of thought, habits of action. And as we know, ideologies like that can be every bit as potent as your appetites and your feelings and controlling you. So something that's capable of shaking those up and shattering them, has the potential to really alter otherwise fixed aspects of society. And as you're saying, prior to the Axial Age, in the earlier mystery religion period, those things were a regular component of Greek civilization. I mean, you can see the list. There are many different mystery religions in Greece that are running around, and people are joining different ones. They're trying them out. They're going through the rituals, and they come out of them changed. And it might explain why, for a long time, Greece had a greater ability than we do to make radical changes to their governments. I mean, like, they would periodically just rewrite the city constitution. Can you imagine the United States ever rewriting its constitution short of a civil war? I mean, we had a civil war, and all we did is add a few amendments. It's like we are so rigid and stuck, whereas these Greeks would periodically just say, we're doing it all wrong, let's change everything. And where did that flexibility come from? Well, maybe it's the mystery religions and, people dropping mushrooms and coming out of them going, whoo, wow, man, I was so totally wrong. You're right, let's go do this new thing. I don't know. I'm just speculating. But I think you're right. There's some element of, when we get into the new Noetic, Socratic, intellectualized approach to philosophy that starts acting as a skeptic. Kenneth Smith describes it as a corrosive acid for culture, that it breaks down traditions, and its justification is, well, these traditions haven't been examined properly. The unexamined life is not worth living for a man, says Socrates, according to Plato, and that's probably an authentic paraphrase. But the problem is, a life of radical examination doesn't just remove the detritus, it's also capable of tearing down the healthy structures that have allowed your civilization to exist at all. Like solidarity. Why should we stay together as a polis? Why shouldn't we just turn on each other and be each man for himself, the way that the Benalsoi want? Well, it is a sub-rational, it's an emotional, sophrosune level thing. And if somebody over intellectualizes it, they can talk themselves out of it. This is why the Greeks are really big on, you're allowed to be intellectually active, except that there are certain sacred things you must not trespass on. Right? Everything in the Greeks is defined not just by a positive, but by a negative. Yes, these are the things you should do, but here's a list of things you must not do. They've got their taboos. And part of the reason is that the taboos are walling off the sacred and trying to keep it safe from the marketplace, trying to keep it safe from over-analytical, critiques and criticism, skepticism, and so forth. But by the time we get to Socrates, everything's up for grabs. And after Socrates, really everybody starts questioning every last thing. The religion starts collapsing. Civil wars become, what week is it? That'll tell you which civil war we're in. That acidic quality in which the bonds of civilization are eaten through by radical skepticism is one of the ways to typify that shift into the axial age. So thank you for bringing that up. It's really critical here.
Did they ever say to Socrates that talking with your own diamond is the impossible?
Yeah, that's more or less what they told him. It's like that's not what daimons do. So if you're talking to somebody, it ain't your daimon. And if you don't know what your daimon is, how can you be the wisest man in all of Greece? It's like that's where we start. You have to understand your own ethos. So they're having a tug of war about things that are so fundamental that they're even deeper than the Olympian religion. I mean, this is the old strata of the religion underneath the gods. So they get really upset when you start messing with that stuff. It's like if your buddy wants to do brain surgery on you, like, oh, I'm willing to experiment with many things, but keep your instruments out of my skull. I don't like where this is going. Thanks, Stephen. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Since we are now in the Roman age and the Christian age, I thought it would be important to bring up the concept of the Greco-Roman culture. It seems to me one of the problem with the Greco-Roman culture is that it's sort of like created a measurement and an objectification of these inner concepts. I was thinking specifically the Roman sword. The Roman says, we have a short sword because that stands for courage. You can make up the difference by just taking one step further. That's courage. That's objectification of courage rather than an inner concept. It becomes externalized in an instrumental measurement of things. It seems to me that's a very important concept because now you could show, well, it's not the internal thing, it's how that internal thing is measured in an external relationship in terms of a measurement. Let's just check the length of your sword and see if you are courageous after all. So that seems interesting because I'm thinking, you know, I think the Romans had this term ratio, which I objected to when I was studying that concept in relationship to the Greeks. It seems to me what ratio is objectification of something. In other words, the thing about the mystery religions is that you don't know what you don't know. So the what you don't know is always deeper, which is like, how should I say, a deeper thing that's within your sort of consciousness, but it's deeper than that. And in a sense, it's always the whatness of the thing because you don't know what it is. It emerges as you try to examine it. Maybe it emerges and unfolds itself. But ratio stops that process. Oh, it's that. That's what it is. It's that short saw. That's the manifestation of your courage, you know? And so, in a funny way, that objectification means a kind of rationalization. Now we could objectify it. We don't have to go to the mystery religion that has, like, what is what? We know what it is because it's that. We have objectified it. And I wonder whether we carry forth that objectification of measurements in terms of it transitioning into the modern age. And that objectification, by the way, penetrated the Christian religion because religion itself became objectified as a rule-based situation rather than the fact that some wise man has said something, and you try to figure out what he actually said, so it remains somewhat embodied in the whatness rather than the thatness, because the thatness seems to be is not only a measurement but a linguistic objectification of something, you know. And so I think that's a very important transition from the Greeks to the Greco-Romans to the Romans to the Christian religion, because we now know that if you did something wrong, you have to go confess. And that's what it is. It's like that's an objectification rather than, oh yeah, well, think about it, and try to figure out what the hell's wrong with you. That sort of thing. It's sort of interesting. I think that that objectification become a stepping stone from the Greeks to the Greco-Romans to Christianity to the modern age. And we now no longer believe in what you believe. We believe, let's just go test it out and measure it. Oh, you fell a little short. So I think I think in a funny way, that's kind of like the beginning of the Copernican turn in a funny way, right? Because we know what it is. We measured it, you know. And now we're actually beginning to think about it in quantum physics that we could objectify that, you know, that dark matter and dark energy is not a mystery. We 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 got the super collider, you know, and CERN, and we can objectify it and actually measure it. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, that's right on. So I just threw a bunch of Greek terms in here. And this is trying to trace for you guys about timocracy and time, which comes from time. It's polity is an easier idea. So we talked about that idea, right? The polis, the organism that is larger, that is all of the individuals together make up the polis. And there's several steps of organization in between. But you remember, this is one of the things from chapter 4 that Kenneth says that the fundamental metaphor for things to the Greeks is not a thing; it's an organism. There really aren't any things. There's only organisms and organism relationships between organisms, which themselves are an organism too. And so you get organisms within organisms within organisms, and that's the structure of the cosmos, which itself is an organism. And this is the way that the Greeks see the structure of everything. So it's not just Legos. To be an organism, it has behavior. And that behavior is associated with a way of life. What does that organism need in order to survive? And one of the ways that the Greeks conceive of this is that every form of life depends on other life that it consumes or exploits. It's zoe that permits it to live a life, a bios that depends on that zoe. And if somebody messes with your relationship to your zoe, they're threatening your existence. And so therefore, for the organism, the larger superorganism to exist, we each have to understand each other's domain that we operate in. So some of us are fishermen, and some of us are reindeer herders, and others are carpenters. Some of us are anesthesiologists, and some of us are actors. Some of us are programmers. Some of us are artists. And what we do in the ancient Greek concept of society is each of us learns our area to the best of our ability. And in that area, and they've got words for these things. The time is the office. That's the area. Another way to think of it is the nomos, your apportioned right or your apportioned range. You remember the myth where Zeus and Poseidon and Hades together cast lots for which part of the cosmos each of them is going to govern. And that's how Zeus ends up with the fire of the heavens, the lightning, the thunderbolt. And how Poseidon ends up with the ocean, and how Hades ends up with the cold air under the earth, where souls are, psyche, which are made of air. And so that has this concept, Moira, the fate has this other concept of lots, as in the gods cast lots to decide who was going to get which portion of the cosmos that would be theirs to govern. And all of this is an analogy from the clan system, that the reindeer clan is not going to tell the fisherman clan what to do, because the fisher clan knows it better than the reindeer clan, and vice versa. The fisher clan is not going to tell the reindeer clan what to do. The reindeer clan is not going to tell the fisher clan what to do, and so on. Each of us has our apportioned range, and that apportioned range is both a positive thing of things that we do and must do, that is our duty, and a much larger range around it of things that we must not do, because that's not our domain. We don't do those things. Other people do those things. And if we trespass upon them, that's that term hyperbasia, stepping across, invading your neighbor's sphere, then we can expect ptonos, which is the immediate and shocking reaction to the hubris that we displayed through our hyperbasia. If Poseidon attempts to arrogate to himself the rights of Hades, he can expect to get his ass kicked by Hades. And not in an equal struggle. Hades is so much better at what Hades does than Poseidon if Poseidon tries to do what Hades does. It's like The Nightmare Before Christmas, right? Jack Skellington has no business running Christmas. He doesn't know what he's doing. But in that movie, he was able to do away with Santa Claus and stick him on hold because that was the way that the storyteller wanted to tell a story. In the Greek version, if he went over there and tried to run Christmas, Santa Claus would have kicked his ass because Santa Claus is Santa Claus, and Jack Skellington can't be Santa Claus. He doesn't know how. He completely lacks. And the amount of expertise it takes to be excellent within your domain is so vast that nobody else is going to smart their way to it in an hour study or a week of study or anything like that. They're just way ahead of you. You got to do the things that you're great at, the things that are your lot. So this concept of the forbidden areas and the not only permitted but demanded areas, and that every organism has them, is central to the concept of social structure, political structure, economic structure, justice. Their whole cosmology is based on it. And as Cornford argues in From Religion to Philosophy, he says that the idea that Hades and Poseidon and Zeus drew lots, it didn't come first. That was derived from the clan system and the way the clan system allocated responsibilities. Whose job is it to grow the corn? Whose job is it to build the boats? Everybody's got a job, and that job is the thing that they become expert at, and other people will not mess with that. Time is the office of the god. That is the domain, the demesne of the god. And by extension, retroactively, it also means that Time refers to the fact that Ginny is an actress, and I am not an actress. It's her Time to be an actress. And it's my Time not to be an actress. It's Sharon's Time to be an anesthesiologist. And it's her Time not to be an actress. And it's Ginny's Time not to be an anesthesiologist. All of these are bound up with the concept of Time. So if you look at the idea of a timocracy, what the term contains embedded within it, although not in a way that's transparent to a modern, who's always looking for a one-word translation. This takes a book to translate, right? I mean, From Religion to Philosophy kind of gets you in the general department. You still have to work for it to put the idea together. A timocracy is basically saying it's an expertise network. We're all going to bring together our different areas of expertise, and we're going to each govern our own area, which we're the expert at. And we're not going to try to govern everybody else's area, which we don't know shit about, because we're incompetent at those things. We're just going to focus on the thing we're good at. We're going to be cheetahs and peregrine falcons and dolphins and all of these other things together. And we're not going to try to pretend that we are what we're not, or that we're not what we are. That's timocracy. So you can see how this is, when I say the Wikipedia section that I pointed you guys to is pretty good, I didn't mean it was perfect, because they certainly can't translate polity for us, and they also definitely can't translate timocracy for us. I mean, maybe if they went and got a degree and spent all their time studying this thing, they could figure it out. You know, I've been after this for a few decades, and I've been building off of Kenneth Smith's work, who's been building off of Hannah Arendt's and Nietzsche's and all that. But it's clear that this is what they're talking about. And that this is very different from let's all get together and vote on what to have for lunch. You can see why Aristotle would say a bunch of people just getting together and voting on what they want is the opposite of this, right? I'm going to vote on what Sharon should do as an anesthesiologist. What is that? Stupidity? It's dangerous stupidity. I should have no say in what Sharon does as an anesthesiologist. It's best for everyone if I keep my trap shut. And that's what part of what it means to be a timocracy. Phil, tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I want to go back to Antigone because that's such an important play. Okay? Because Antigone was still has some version of the divine. So she was a tragic hero. She fought for what is divine, the family and the gods, that he should bury his brother. But the contradiction is that Cleon was living in a state. He has to found the state, okay? Not depending on the god, but because he's concerned about the polis, the state. So he's setting it up. That's in some sense a contradiction to the divine. So he was also a tragic hero because he had to bring this polis together. Because if there's no polis, there is no grouping in relationship to things. Okay? Because it starts with the fact you have to have a civilization, a city, in a sense, to govern. Okay, so they were both tragic heroes in different ways, and it was a very important. I finally come to the conclusion they were both tragic heroes, fighting for different things, and I wonder whether that isn't the funny thing that we're stuck in, because when you are away from the divine already, in some sense, but you still have to create a state, then what you have is you have an understanding that the gods did not write the laws. Okay? Because the laws, the Constitution, there is a preamble. Where did the preamble come from? Where did the preamble come from? It's like you made it up. Yeah, okay, the preamble, in a sense, governs the Constitution, which governed the statutes and so forth. But where did the preamble come from? That was strictly, you made it up in order to govern the polis. So how does that work? I mean, like, because it's unjustified that you have a preamble that said this is the ultimate constraint. It should have came from the gods, or something divine at least, right? But you have a state. You can't go around asking God every time because you have the city to worry about. So the contradiction between the gods and the divine order and the fact that you have to have a state to run, then in a sense, you're dipping into the unknown and try to make it known because you wrote the preamble, right? And so God did, you could, I suppose you could say, I went to, whatever temple and asked the gods and he spoke to me. And there I have the preamble. No. So there's a funny contradiction in the sense that we live in the city, or we try to live in the city if we could hold it together. But on the other hand, we also have some understanding that that's not a divine thing. It was written by a man. Because, I suppose you could say, unless you're Moses and went up to Mount Sinai and God actually wrote the Ten Commandments, I suppose you could say that's the case. But otherwise, like, where were you? Oh, I was up there trying to write these laws, which I heard from God. Come on. So, in some sense, there's a contradiction in human existence itself because we can't exist without the city state, something that governs us, but we have no right to have that govern us. That's made by Cleon. He had no right to write the preamble, say it's all set in law, because I don't think God even have writing, to tell you the truth. All right, that's it. So we live in a contradiction. So you can't just say, well, the Greeks are right because the Greeks were also wrong because they're the one that wants the city to begin with. That's
right.
it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, yeah. As you were talking, I was thinking about the point Stephen often makes, which is that, and Kenneth makes this point too, which is that hyper rationalists, hyper noetic people believe that rationalism can justify itself, but it can't. Rationality analysis has the ability to break things down into smaller pieces, but it doesn't have the ability to synthesize effectively. Or you can synthesize, but there's no guarantee that what you've synthesized bears any relationship to reality at all. All you know is that it might be logically or mathematically valid. You don't know that it's true. And for every 100 logically valid propositions, 99 of them are false. They're valid, but the premises you began with were wrong. They were flawed in some way. And as a result, so are your conclusions. Even though you logically derive every step of the way correctly, that doesn't do you any good. It's fruit of the poison tree, if you will. So, Stephen talks about this, the way that the modern experiment is to divorce the structures of government and the economy from their original justification, which was God's will. Right? All the medievalisms that we bring forward into the modern era, as Nietzsche says, we dethrone God and take the remainder and believe that it's self-sufficient and self-coherent. But of course, it's not. It had evolved for 1,000 years within the shadow of the church, and not just the shadow of the church. It had evolved as an appendage of the church. The divine right of kings was the justification for kingship. So you kick out the God, Now what's your justification for kingship? Well, in the modern era, we just try not to talk about that part. I mean, and so it's like you say, the preamble, there's the preamble. And what is the basis for this preamble? And the answer is, shh, don't ask that question. For 1,000 years, we could tell you it was God. Now well, shut up. Just don't ask that question. So
Well, Napoleon did crown himself.
yeah, right. I mean, we try to make it recursive. Well, because we said so. But, because we said so boils down to might makes right. It's because you can't stop me. There were enough of us who voted the same way, and we've got the police on our side, so screw you. This is the thing, is that, philosophy says you have to look very closely at your foundations. What are you using to derive your initial principles from? And if you're not clear about that, then it contaminates all the rest. You could be as systematic as you want. It contaminates all of your conclusions. All your logic can only lead you to flawed conclusions if you've got flawed premises. So it is one of the contradictions built into the structure of the modern epoch. So let's dive into my first big error. And this error is from 2 weeks ago. And we were talking about agency and contingency. And Joe was having some difficulties connecting. And I was trying to make a point about agency and contingency. We were talking about this fragment from chapter 6, where he says, Kenneth says, there's a strong parallel of Jesus's doctrine of personal accountability with the Greek sense of fatalism and daimon. And we were talking about, Greek, daimon, fate. So this is like character is fate, ethos, anthropoi, daimon. This is clearly, once you learn how Kenneth Smith uses keywords, you can tell that this is an homage to Heraclitus and to the whole kind of free will versus determinism, the structure of the human psyche, the Thales' proposition that everything is made up of daimones. All of that stuff is tied up in here. And as we were pointing out, that this parallel structure, later in this sentence, he's talking about agency versus contingency. This is agency versus contingency here. And so I spoke at the point of 2 hours 50 minutes and 40 seconds. I was talking about agency and contingency and how they applied here. And then abruptly I then said, and even in the situation, and then I made an aside to say, this is a point that Joe will appreciate because it's drawing off of what Joe has to say. And I said, even in the situation, and I went, nope, I've lost it. I can't remember what I was going to say. So, an hour before we had our session today, David reminded me of that. He texted me and said, did you want to go back and look and see what it was you were going to say there? Because it sounded like it was going to be good. And then you just completely dropped it. So I did. I went back and I watched the video and I took notes and said, oh, I remember what I was going to say. Now I have to say it. So this is a follow-on, right? Sometimes my error is as a mortal, my brain fails me. What good is it to be smart when you're immortal? Well, it's like half of a good thing, and the other half is just sort of embarrassing. So I lost track of what I was saying in the middle of saying it while incredibly excited about it. So here's the issue. We were talking about Kenneth's use of the word fate is not talking about, well, who done it at the end of the book. It's not talking about how everything comes out. It's talking about your teleology, which arises from your character. The character of an acorn drives it in the direction of being an oak tree, even if it fails to get there. It is fated to try. It's genetics. It's internal structures, it's hormones, it's cellular structure, it's chemistry. All of that drive it in the direction of, and I use the term loosely, wanting or insisting on unfolding order from within itself over and over and over until it becomes an oak tree. And as the point Stephen makes is, of course, that most acorns never become oak trees. Nature is profligate in creating opportunities to create the new order. But that doesn't mean it isn't trying. Its ethos is directing it in that direction to try to become an oak tree, right? So there's outcomes and there's fates, and they're two different things. And part of the confusion in modernity is that we make them the same thing. And by making them the same thing, we really confuse ourselves about the relationship between free will and determinism. But the Greeks didn't make that mistake, or at least sometimes they didn't make that mistake. They separated them. And they said, character is fatal, not because it determines outcomes, but because it determines the direction you keep yearning and pushing in. And what that yearning and pushing means is that your agency, if given the contingency that will allow it to thrive, the acorn will grow into an oak tree when the conditions are right. Now, for thousands of acorns, for millions of acorns every year, maybe billions, I don't know how many acorns are dropped in sum total around the world, but whatever that number is, contingency is rarely correct, right? Too dry, too wet, a pig ate me, I fell on a rock. There's a million reasons why the contingency might not be right. But the thing about sophrosune, which an acorn has, which we don't have, is that in those rare opportunities when the contingency is correct, the ethos of the acorn does determine the outcome. It does, in fact, become an oak tree, right? Living systems with sophrosune fail more often than they succeed because contingency is often not correct. But when contingency is correct, organisms with sophrosune succeed more often than they fail because almost every effort is pointed in generally one of the right directions for that organism. It's why there continue to be cheetahs and acorns and oak trees, right? When they get their chance, and that's the Greek term kairos, right? Kairos, opportunity, the moment that is different from other moments, the season in which the contingency is correct for you. When kairos arrives, an organism that has sophrosune will act at that moment the right way. And the reason it will act is that sophrosune has it obsessed with acting to do the right thing. The cheetah can't stop thinking about the gazelle. Normally the gazelle doesn't make a mistake and the cheetah doesn't get a chance. But the gazelle isn't perfect, and every so often the gazelle screws up. And when that happens, the cheetah is there because the cheetah has not stopped obsessing about the gazelle. The cheetah is not downstairs playing video games, right? I mean, the cheetah didn't decide, I think I'll run for president. The cheetah's like, no, I want the gazelle, the pretty, pretty, pretty gazelle, the shiny gazelle. This is my whole life. It doesn't
And
miss the
also, just
opportunity.
wanted to say that, Rick, human beings also eat acorns,
We
In
do.
In Korea, acorn dish is like a delicacy that they make these jello-like thing that they make with acorns. Delicious.
That's right. That's right. So human beings are part of the contingency that's preventing a
Yeah.
certain number of acorns from becoming oak trees.
And I would dare to say that it's billions of acorns that are falling every year.
Yes.
Maybe billions.
Yes.
They would have had to have prepared them in some way to make them edible.
They do. They do. They leach them. They leach the tannins out of them in water.
So
Yeah.
they contain cyanide, don't they?
Yeah, that's
Just
right.
tannins. Just tannins.
Just tannins. There's no cyanide.
Yeah. They're just very bitter.
Yeah. Have you ever had acorn muk, like a jello, like a Korean dish? Has anyone else have that?
No,
Oh,
I
it's
want to.
delicious. Yeah, it's
Now you make me hungry.
Yeah, it's really good.
So agency and contingency. So the Greeks say, so on the one hand, it's in the modern world, you get people saying everything is up to us. You just have to want something enough and it'll happen. Like Disney films tell you that over and over and over. Half of the Disney cartoons, the whole moral of the story is you should get what you want and you should want it hard. And if you want it hard, you'll get it. And that's utter bullshit. I mean, tell that to billions of acorns every year. It's like, no, I'm rotting. I want it to be an oak, but instead I'm rotting. You don't get things just because you want them, right? So the Greeks have a more sophisticated idea about this. So that's hyper agency. That Disney just go for it and you'll get what you want. That's hyper agency. But you also get these fatalists who say, why bother doing anything? I mean, the outcome's all pre-fated. So I shouldn't even try. And you see this in politics. You get there's a certain category of left-wingers, some of whom I grew up with, who believe that the forces of history will naturally unfold the future development of society into improvements, and that history is a great march of progress that leads from savagery to civilization, and all you have to do is sit back and wait, and everything will get better. And that is self-pacification and infantilization, right? That's where you tell yourself that contingency controls 100% of the situation and agency accounts for nothing. So why bother? Both of these are opposite ends of the spectrum. You often get, in fact, if I'm going to stereotype in U.S. politics, you get right wingers saying it's all agency, and you get left wingers saying it's all contingency. Now, it's not the case that all right wingers think it's all agency, or that all left wingers think it's all contingency. It's much more complicated than that. But the stereotypical answer about, the forces of history will solve all our problems, you don't usually hear that from the right. You usually hear that from a subset of the left. And likewise, the whole, all that matters is me and my will, and I should go out in the world and make things the way I want them, you usually hear that from the right and not from the left. But in both cases, it's a childish caricature of what the Greeks understood in a much more sophisticated way. They saw it as a dialectic. They said, why would it be just one? Of course it's both. And you could tell it just by looking at acorns and oaks. Usually they land in the wrong place. But even if it lands in the wrong place, if you contribute your agency to the acorn's agency, you can massively improve its circumstances by changing its contingency. You can pick it up off the rock and plant it in a beautiful spot and water it where it's got sun. And now its contingency is so much better, it may well grow into an oak tree when it wouldn't have before. There's a complicated relationship between these two. It's a dialectic, right? And that's not that hard an idea to understand. I mean, even a child can learn to understand that it's some of both, and that there's a give and take and a tug of war between them. And yet, modern philosophers and political theorists and so on keep trying to reduce this thing to one or the other. It's embarrassing. So the reason that I'm bringing this up is not to talk about politics, is to talk about this idea that the Greeks believe that you have to cultivate your ethos. You have to. It's the way that we're born, whatever we inherit, both whether genetically or culturally from our parents and our neighbors and our teachers, is not good enough. It's not good enough because they're all imperfect beings too. So we have a duty to study our ethos and figure out where its flaws are, and then to work out strategically how to compensate for those flaws. Okay, this acorn is sitting on a rock. It's never going to become an oak tree, but I can compensate for that. Phil can get up and walk over here and pick up this acorn and go plant it in that lovely piece of soil. And we can compensate for this flaw in its circumstances. I can compensate for the gene that I have for alcoholism by saying, I'm never gonna touch a bottle. That's my solution. That's a test I don't need to run. There are ways that you can compensate for these things, but only if you know that they're there and if you accept that your character is flawed. So the Greeks say you have a duty, you have the ability, say the Greeks, to modify your character by cultivating it. When we say character is fate, we don't mean the outcome is predetermined, because you can change your fate by changing your character, right? But that it's not just an ability we have, it's a duty we have, because the worst that people can be is so much worse than any animal, right? People at their worst are demons, they're devils, they're just awful. People at their best are like angels. We can do amazing things. The difference between the two is so big that we have a moral responsibility. And this was the issue. We were talking about morality in chapter 6. And we were saying, why did Kenneth say that there's a moral issue here when it comes to character? And this is why. You have a moral duty to cultivate your character to ensure that when contingency offers you the right circumstances, that you will do the right thing, whatever that may be. As Aristotle says, it should be some form of sophrosune. You should be acting towards what is the healthiest for yourself, what is the healthiest for your community, for your species, and you should be acting for what is healthiest for the whole ecosystem, for the whole world. And if you operate on all those levels at the same time, that's politics. And if you don't, it's more like Polyphemus and worshiping his belly, right? It's not politics, it's some sub-political thing. So where were we? The place that we got to is that we were saying the outcome is not your moral responsibility, right? Because there's contingency and that's not within your control. But the what you do in that situation, your agency, that is your moral responsibility. Because it can't be anybody else's moral responsibility. I can't blame Donald for what I do in a circumstance because Donald's got his own behavior to blame on himself. So he doesn't want to take on my bad behavior along with his bad behavior. He's like, you know what, Rick, you take on your own bad behavior and I'll keep my bad behavior and we'll each solve our own piece of the problem. It's a fundamental, it's time, it's part of timocracy that we each have to own our own bullshit. And we're not trying to scapegoat other people for our own crap. We have a moral responsibility not to control what the outcome is, but to ensure that in that moment we did the best we could. Right? That's where the morality lies. So what I started to say, I said, and even in this situation, now we come to where I lost the thread. So for those for whom this was a rehash because you were already there the first time, my apologies. But now we're at the point where I was saying, yeah, Joe was reconnecting at that point on that call, and I was going, yeah, this is for Joe, because Joe was the one who really got us the concept of agency versus contingency as a shorthand for this whole area that allows us to talk about this dialectic with just a few words. And what I wanted to say was the following. And this is all Kenneth Smithian stuff. This is all Hellenic stuff for sure. Even in the situation where your agency is strongly crippled by the contingency of having an unhealthy ethos. So suppose that even in that situation, it remains my responsibility. So for example, I'm born with the alcoholic gene, and that's not fair. I mean, nobody else on this call was necessarily born with the alcoholic gene, but I was born with it. So how can it be my responsibility? And this is where moderns confuse fault and responsibility. It may not be my fault that I was born with the alcoholic gene, but it's still my responsibility. You have to be responsible for more than just the things that are your fault. You have to take responsibility for your portion of the cosmos, whether it's fair or not fair. And it's not fair. We're all dealt, a hand from the deck of cards, and my hand has the alcoholism gene in it. That's not fair. How come nobody else has the alcoholism? How come I have this one hand tied behind my back with this thing? And, this goes back to what Stephen says frequently, which is nature's not concerned with whether you win or lose. Nature's going to set up a diverse set of opportunities, and a lot of people are going to fail, and that's what's going to happen. But, you got to make the best you can of the hand that you've been dealt. So, but it doesn't have to be genetic. I could be born into a family with generational cycles of emotional abuse. It could be my reflex to abuse my children or my spouse. I could have been taught terrible anger management strategies. So that whenever I get angry, I don't say, I'm feeling angry. I say, you made me angry. So you're the enemy and I have to punish you for making me angry. Right? A lot of domestic violence cycles around this dysfunctional anger management. And that's part of my ethos. It doesn't have to be genetic, right? Because the ethos learns and grows. And it learned from my parents, maybe, to be bad with anger. And now that's set me up with a terrible hand to play with. But even though it's not my fault, because fault is a broken model, it's still my responsibility, because it's not anybody else's character that's the issue. It's my character. And as hard as it is for me to get access to my character and change it, it's impossible for anybody else to do it. I mean, they can barely get access to their own characters. Right? The ethos is hidden within us. It's the hidden harmony. It's difficult. So and here we come to the critical element. And this was something Donald has talked about and other people have talked about, which is to become an Aristos, you need the example of an Aristos. You need to see somebody living the life of an Aristos to believe it, to understand it, to see that it's possible. Like the example of the Olympics, until you see the guy do the high jump higher than anybody's done it before, you might have thought it was impossible. But now you can't think it's impossible because you just witnessed it with your own eyes. If you just witnessed Socrates give his own life on a point of philosophical principle, you now know that it's possible to do that. Your mind is dilated. Your possibilities have dilated. And so this is the thing. What if you go through your life and you never see anybody take responsibility for their own character? What if you live in this is another one that Stephen likes to bring up. What if you live in a culture where everybody around you is just going for their appetites and for the easy answers, and they don't want to cultivate their character? They just want to satisfy their appetites or satisfy their ideologies. Then what? Where are you supposed to have learned that you can cultivate your own character? Where's your agency and moral, responsibility then? And the answer is, it's exactly the same. Yes, your contingency is worse because you've never witnessed an example. And we all know contingency plays a major role in these things. But it's still your responsibility. Even if, in this situation, it's impossible for you to meet your responsibility, even if failure is foreordained, it remains your responsibility. Right? I'm in a room, nobody else is in. I accidentally start a fire. Nobody else is close. Nobody else sees it. Even if I'm unable to put out the fire, maybe because I'm handcuffed to the chair, it doesn't matter. It's still my responsibility. The fact that I failed in the responsibility, that it was impossible for me to meet it, doesn't change the fact that it was my responsibility. The Greeks are really comfortable with this. Moderns are really uncomfortable with this. We're all, and again, I always think of Stephen when I think about these things. We're all concerned with fairness. We're all concerned with guilt. We all want it to not be our fault. We want to find somebody to scapegoat. But the adult thing to do is to recognize sometimes in life I'm not going to be able to meet my responsibilities, and yet they remain mine. And that this is why morality is here. This is what morality has to do with this. It is moral to acknowledge that even when I fail in my responsibilities, they remain mine. Right? So I'll expand on this more later, but let's do hands first. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
You tell a good story, but I think it's more complicated than that. The reason I think it's more complicated than that is that mankind, let's start with Cleon. You start a civilization. As the civilization gets more and more complex, it becomes a second ecology. It produces own grounding. So you're not just a shark or, a fish by yourself. It changes the dynamics. So all agency actually changes the contingency itself, not nature. So therefore, we have a double system in this sense. As an example, uh, Peter Zion keeps saying that, like when civilization changed from an agrarian society to a industrial society, that completely changed. Because what happened is in a current society, people had a lot of children. That's the way it is. A lot of children die, so they had a lot of children because it's almost like free labor. That's just the way it is. When you have an industrial society, you move into the city. You move into the city, you live in a small apartment. You can't have a large family. It's too damn expensive. So you have to change the situation as it is. And that's not necessarily caused by nature, that's caused by the culture itself, that environmental structure. So the agency becomes our contingency to the point that, in a sense, you don't live in a small apartment, let's say a one-bedroom apartment, you can have most have just one child, which means that now you have a situation where there's a population collapse because always through civilization, except for pandemics, population has always grown. And we do not know how to deal with a situation when, for instance, like in Japan or Korea, China, a woman has maybe 1.2 child, and does not sustain even the basis of a civilization. They do not know how to deal with that in some sense. Okay. This is a completely different change in this sense. So, in some sense, like we created this complexity that now is not just agency, I'll go get an acorn and I'll make it into a delicious dessert. No, that you change nature. But on the other hand, you're now in a situation, for instance, when you have an industrial society and Thomas Edison invented a light bulb, the day is expanded. Women now are freer to do something else other than just taking care of the house and mothering and all that. So they want to be free and do something with their lives. And all. In addition, they have to now become so expensive. You have to have two to work in order to make the single living that you used to have. So all these things have created a structure that's much more complex than dealing with nature. Not only that, in nature we pilfer you know, the oceans, so there's less and less fish. I mean, we have completely changed the dynamics. It's almost like we're dinosaurs and we're going to eat up everything in some sense. So we are a cause, not singularly that I am guilty for any of this. I'm maybe partially in the sense that I didn't have to move into a small apartment, you know. Uh, so in some sense, like This is just much more complex because now you have a double wheel going, nature and, you know, second ecology of civilization itself. It all started with Cleon, you know, in some sense, because he created this structure and he had to, the polis. The polis has become cancerous and become uh, uh, so fantastic large that we can't control. We do not know how to control it. So I think it's a much more complicated situation than just, dealing with the gods of nature. That's it. So
Thank you, Phil. Thank you for saying that. It's last week we talked about recursion and how you can write incredibly powerful programs if you write them recursively, where the program calls itself. But the moment you do that, where you get a feedback loop going, it becomes really hard to think about because a small bit of code can do a vast amount of work, and it can be very difficult to figure out what the consequences of your actions are. In fact, when they teach recursion in programming, they don't teach it first; they teach it last. It's one of the last things you learn how to do. Yeah, even though it's so simple and it involves so little code, because it's just so hard to think about what are the consequences, intended or unintended. And anytime you start to get the kind of feedback loops you're talking about, you get massive scales of complexity possible. That's what the dialectic does. You get pushing and pulling in all kinds of different directions. It can do work. You've generated energy. So, of course, I really needed. I'm so glad you spoke up when you did. That needed to be said. Agency and contingency have very complex relationships to each other, and it's part of what's brilliant about this model of human free will and determinism is that it's capable of describing such a wide range of outcomes with such a simple model. A model that, like recursion, is simple but very hard to think all the way through. This thing about being responsible for things that you're guaranteed to fail at, which, I mean, I understand why that's not appealing at all. But this is why the model for an Aristos is Sisyphus rolling the boulder up the hill. It's not pleasant. It is just very hard, uncomfortable work. And it makes you, it's not just physically laborious, but emotionally and morally laborious to be thinking about taking responsibility for stuff that you really couldn't have made at that time in your life. You didn't know enough to have the outcome come out any better than it did, and yet still it was your responsibility. It's like being given a job you're only partly qualified to do. That's life, right? Sometimes you're going to be able to pull it together and make it work right, and sometimes it's going to be a huge blunder with bad consequences, and yet there's no one else to blame it on because it's us. I mean, who the hell else is supposed to act on it? One can see why people would flee into either it's all agency or it's all contingency, because either of those, even though they're wrong and generate enormous downstream negative consequences, they're still easier to hold in your heart than a certain amount of the time in life I'm going to fail in ways that hurt myself and others. That's just not comfortable to live with. It's not a nice thing to carry around. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, that's a problem I was exploring in history, that we live in an age where people have this graph about progress. We've reached a point where we're just going to go up and never look backwards. And there's a huge amount of people who think they're smart who believe this. The only reason previous cultures failed is they were stupid. They're not smart like us. They had the wrong idea. But looking at the progress of technology, we had a previous period that was technically progressive. This earlier Greco-Roman phase, this phase coming from the early Greek classical period until about the 2nd century BC. And then progress ground to a halt in the Greco-Roman culture. One of the last bits of progress, which they didn't create, was the Celts had perfected the iron sword to a degree. The Romans got hold of this newfangled, rather nice iron sword and cut their Greek opponents to pieces. Quite to the shock of the Greeks, they couldn't understand how an iron sword could do such damage because they were used to iron that was soft, that was just a stand-in for bronze when you couldn't afford it. And of course what we got, and this is the thing, people think that if there's progress to be had, we're going to make it. But the later Romans prove that. There was progress to be made, there were advancements, but nothing was happening. You know, people tell the science fiction story about the Romans getting the steam engine, which true, that would have solved their later problem. But there are a lot of steps to getting towards a steam engine. And somehow in the Middle Ages, we start to see the progress that leads to the later advancement occurring. And really, they must have been geniuses in the Middle Ages to come up with stuff like the relatively perfected blast furnace to make pig iron. You have to have been a genius to have come up with this. It wasn't easy. People think, oh, it was easy. No, it wasn't easy. And they don't seem to understand now. They think, oh, we have progress now. We will progress forever. You know, if we have a problem, technology will come along and give us everything we need. It's a bit like one of those old science fiction movies where people believe that, what was it, Forbidden Planet, where, oh, we've created this, the great technology, the great machine, but it turns on them. And yeah, I think it was about 20 years ago, I was looking, you know, there's an energy problem. That if you want more, you have to find the energy to do it. And I mean, the nuclear energy, the nuclear energy that we've got, you know, the alternative solar energy, wind power, they don't cut it. This is a real problem. They're looking for, what is it, fusion power. Well, if they got something workable, yeah, maybe that would cut it. But people, they're just waiting around. As you said, passive. Oh, don't worry. Go back to sleep. It'll be there the next morning. Presently, they cannot comprehend that progress doesn't work the way they think it does. It doesn't appear like the magic genie all the time. They cannot conceive that they're not as smart as they imagine they are. It's beyond their comprehension. They cannot critique themselves. They critique everybody else, but they cannot imagine that they're wanting. It's beyond their comprehension. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. A classic example of that is Moore's law, that computer power doubles every 2 years on average, and there was no reason to think it was a law, but the prediction has held since 1975, and so everyone began to treat it as a law, except that semiconductor advancement began slowing around 2010. And by 2022, the CEO of NVIDIA said that Moore's law is dead, while the CEO once said, no, it's still there. And the premise that it will always double forever and computers will always get more powerful is based on nothing other than that it has so far. There's no reason to call it a law. I mean, calling it Moore's law makes it sound like E equals MC squared. And it arrogates to itself the status of a natural law just by calling it a law. I mean, vast numbers of people in the IT industry are convinced it's true. But there was never any reason to think it was a law. And when we look at the circumstances for why it happened during the period that it did, it's easy to see why we were primed for a few decades of success in miniaturization. I mean, all of our technology had advanced to the point where it made sense that we were going to have breakthrough after breakthrough. But the thing about miniaturization is you can only do it so long before pretty soon your atoms are touching each other and now your circuits are interfering with each other, or the circuits are so close together that the electromagnetic fields generated by the electricity moving through them begins to interfere with each other. There comes a point where you can't miniaturize any further. And when that happens, the natural law that we assumed meant we were going to just get better and better forever suddenly collapses and reveals itself to have been a contingency rather than an inherent, rather than being the agency of the cosmos, that it was just that way. It was just a contingency of circumstances. We had a very nice Kairos. Donald and I would agree. For a while, we had a very nice Kairos going. And it was very cool that computers got faster and smaller. But of course, it can't go on forever.
Well, it's a bit like a guy falling off a cliff. You keep on
Yep.
asking him how things are going while he's falling. He says, so far, so good.
I love the phrase I can't even hear the phrase "so far so good" now without thinking of that story. It's like, yeah, I haven't hit bottom yet, so what's to complain about? I guess I'll never hit bottom. I haven't done it yet. It must never happen. So quantum computers, everyone, yeah, Jason, everybody hopes that quantum computers will get us on track because everybody wants Moore's law to remain true. But it's not actually a law, and we don't know if it'll be true. I'm always interested in breakthroughs in technology, but I'm no technophile. Even though I've been doing computers for 41 years, you never know, right? It is natural to assume that our parochial circumstances are eternal and universal. That is what it means to be mortal. And when the Greeks say to be mortal is to be an idiot, this is precisely what they mean. That we think that Stephen talks about this with the post-war boom. Where the economy made it, everybody thought we're just going to have to work fewer and fewer hours. We're going to have more and more wealth, and everybody's going to have, more literacy and more survival, and it'll just get better forever. And what they were all ignoring is that there were specific historical circumstances that created that boom. And those historical circumstances, there was no reason to think they would last forever, right? I mean, nothing lasts forever. History's got ebbs and flows, and we just don't want to believe it's true. And in a nutshell, this is Cornford's assessment of Thucydides' critique of what went wrong with the character of Athens that led them into the Peloponnesian War. Is exactly what Stephen's talking about. That they said, things have been going well so far, I guess they'll go well forever. If since we beat the Spartans in these battles, we could beat anybody in any number of battles. So let's just broaden the war to a second front. Let's invade Italy while we're fighting the Spartans. Because winners win and we're winners. It's like the thoughtlessness of thinking that the line will continue forever is what led to the downfall of Athens and ultimately the conquest of the Greeks by the Mycenaeans.
Sounds like the Germans in World War II.
Yeah, same thing. Nobody stopped us yet.
Fantastic success.
We've
conquered France. We've conquered Poland.
We're going to win.
We can't fail.
We can't fail. And Cornford says that Sophocles says, quoting Aeschylus, "This is hubris. This is the issue. It's overreach. It's tonos. When you cross out of your domain into somebody else's domain, there is an immediate, shocking, violent reaction against you that you don't see coming as a result of your hubris. And if only you went into it with humility and a full appreciation of the human condition and its liabilities, you wouldn't be surprised like that. You'd go, maybe we should be cautious now. As the Spartan general says to the Athenians after the Athenians win a battle, now's the time to be gracious in victory and consolidate, not to overreach. And the Athenians are like, haha, you would say that. You're a loser. We're winners. We're just going to win. And the Spartan goes away shaking his head going, here comes tragedy. Anyway, Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, that is a very good point when you're talking about this idea of going all agency or all contingency. It's because I think that that's where everything kind of goes wrong. I think that people sometimes will look at their situation and even take responsibility for the situation that they're in. But then they can have a misperception and actually think that, well, I'm just in the position that I'm in because it's all agency. All contingency. And when you start to think that, then you start to actually have this approach that you're supposed to correct all the world's problems because of the situation that you're in. So that's like this perversion that you get in, because you're in a situation that's, tends to be, unique. And then you forget the fact that, that you do have some degree of agency. And then that leads you to kind of, you think you know how the world ought to work. And so, that's what happens when it goes one way. And then what happens also on the flip side is, obviously, if you ignore the agency aspect of it, or ignore the contingency aspect of it, is that there's a lack of any kind of connection or empathy for anybody else. So the idea of what you were talking about a little bit earlier, linking that to politics, I mean, that's essentially cosmopolitanism, what you were referring to earlier. And cosmopolitanism is like impossible without recognizing the fact that it's partly contingency. And then there is a certain amount of responsibility that comes with that. So, I mean, the way these things manifest themselves, you can kind of see where somebody like Creons and their perversions of understanding the world, that their position is actually dictating everything, that they think that they need to correct the world, and they're absolutely right, and this is the way we go, and that's it. And that's a product of his position. So that's another thing. And I'll just say really quickly, I did appreciate the fact that this idea that we're gonna, this inevitability of just how progress goes up. I mean, I don't even think people really think about what progress even means. And I think that that's the biggest problem. And even this something like Moore's law that we treat like a law, that ignores contingency completely. And, I know somebody else, that there's something called Wright's law. It's another, predictive law, but not a law of nature, obviously. And, people think, oh, this is much more accurate. It's proven out, over time. And they ignore the fact that, everything is, you were living in a period of time. And even this idea that, another one I love is the stock market inevitably goes up. Really? Like, I mean, when everything, like, civilizations don't fall. Yeah, exactly. So it's like, it leads you to kind of have this perverted perception of reality. But the consequences are actually
That's
pretty.
loser talk, Joe. That's loser talk. Winners win.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. That's right. Winners win. That's well said. But no, I think that it does something for the relationships, in the sense that once obviously you go one way or you go the other, it becomes you can become well, as you guys were saying earlier, a tyrant.
Thank you, Joe. That was great. It's interesting stuff, isn't it? I mean, it's as with the concept of ethos anthropoi daimon, so too agency contingency in general as a explanation of outcomes. They're just these simple, elegant dialectics that are capable of so much sophistication. It's shocking how much explanatory power they have. And when you see how much explanatory power they have, and you see how long ago people had these models to work with, and then you read this just brain dead debates today in which people are like, it's all agency. No, it's all contingency. No, you're a poo-poo head. No, well, yeah, we're a stupido. It's just like, what are we? I mean, even kindergartners can behave better than the level of, can be more sophisticated than the level of discourse we have now. I mean, you can teach a kindergartner that they can plant an acorn and grow an oak. You can teach them that. But you can't teach these debating people because, it's either all agency or all contingency. And the ones who think it's all contingency are like, why bother? You can't control anything. Well, you could plant that acorn. Like this fall, I'm going to plant a little oak tree in my backyard because 500 years from now, I want there to be a gigantic oak tree that's benefiting this whole area, and there's butterflies and birds and all this stuff. I want to plant a tree under whose shade I will not be able to sit. I like that little, kind of moral thing. But I can only do that because I recognize there's agency and contingency both at work here. And I have a role to play. No matter how bad things get, I'm never helpless. There's always something that I can do to shift the odds in my favor. And like Phil was saying, the relationship between agency and contingency is complex. When I act in the world, I also change the contingency.
Right.
And it's because of that they say you cultivate your character, because by cultivating your character, you've changed the contingency that controls your agency. So
it's interesting because whenever you go one way, I mean, it's the idea that character even just becomes meaningless.
Right.
In the sense that if you're looking at it as all contingency, because that there's then, well, you can't really manage your character. What are you doing? Like everything's based on the circumstances that you're in. And what happens is when you don't do that, everything around you goes to hell.
Yes. Yeah. And it can be hugely destructive. I mean, just it's people born with the alcoholic gene, if they deny it, if they insist that they're 100% pure free agency, what happens is they don't avoid the bottle. And so they end up in the bottle for the rest of their lives. And they wreck their lives by the refusal to acknowledge that contingency plays a role. It can be, and for me, this isn't just a specific example, although it is a concrete example that's really close to home, but it also illustrates how all the other factors of character work. I mean, the ones that have either negative or positive influences on my capacity for agency, if I deal with them, then I open up whole vistas of possibilities. But if I refuse to acknowledge them, then they control me. They define me. And instead of being an individual, I become a stereotype. This is what the It Could Never Happen to Me book about alcoholism talks about, is the way that all these people living in alcoholic families think that they're individuals. And yet when they compare notes, they discover that there's just like 4 or 5 stereotypical roles that every member of an alcoholic family falls into. The one who's drinking, the one who's the codependent enabler, the one who's the moderator, mediator, peacemaker, the one who's the dramatizer who acts out the problems the family won't talk about. And all over the world are people living these stereotyped lives while imagining that they're individuals. But what's happened is that the contingency in their own character has reduced their scope of free action so much that they're never able to individuate. And they're reduced to saying, well, I'm an individual because I like purple. He's an individual because he likes green. It's like, yeah, but both of you are the dramatizer, actor out getting in trouble kids. And like your whole lives are defined by that. That's why you're both in prison. It's like this you haven't dealt with the problem. You have to turn and confront the issue if you ever want to become a person, and not just a symptom. And that is not something that a modern wants to hear, because hey, we are born with certain inalienable rights, and includes life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Liberty! I'm free, man. I am not. There's no contingency ruling me. I'm free, absolutely 100% free, and I didn't have to work for it. I was born that way. What a destructive idea that is. It really prevents people from taking responsibility, and owning their own bullshit. It's amazing. Anyway, thank you for bringing it up. It's so important.
Oh, thank you. No, I appreciate it.
Hey, Donald, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I'm almost embarrassed to speak following Joe. But
isn't he good?
Yes, he is. He must have gone to a Jesuit college or something. Anyway, we have talked about free will and determinism as it's really an alternative view to agency and contingency. They're not just different names for the same thing. And I was thinking that when we think of free will versus determinism, we already kind of get in trouble, because what we want is a perfectly free will that acts in a perfectly deterministic world so that it can be effective. Because you can't have other things being free, introducing contingencies, getting in the way of your free will. So agency, in contrast to free will, has a concept, I think includes that limitations on your agency. And contingency is somewhat more relaxed than determinism. It's things may or may not interfere with your action as you carry it out. And it's largely that they're unknown or unseen, unexpected. And I was thinking, this is for Joe, because I first saw this in Aquinas, but it was traced back really to Aristotle. The concept of intention and how it changed from antiquity to modernity. And modernity, in our modern law, we normally think of intention as sort of state of mind. What was the actor's state of mind at the time he acted? Whereas in antiquity, intention is a characteristic of the act itself. It's the end, or we'll just say the end or goal that would normally be expected of that action. It may be interfered with or may not be achieved, just like the acorn may not become an oak. My action to cross the street and not get hit by a car may or may not succeed. But, it has a goal, has an intention. But this sort of allows, I think, and Joe hit this at one point earlier, I'm just following Joe around trying to step in his footprints here, to allow us to judge the virtue of acts or the morality of actions, even when they fail, in an environment filled with contingency. What was the expected end of that act versus what really happened, and how that gets apportioned. And the actor doesn't have to be punished or accept that the failure is his responsibility when it's contingency that intervenes. And so, Joe, raise your hand, correct me, I'll go back to sleep.
Thank you, Donald. And thank you, Joe.
Yeah, and thank you, Donald. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. I appreciate that.
Ari, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, that was great with Joe and Donald. Of all things, I want to do something similar. I want to go back to Phil. He said something to me that really lit a fuse or turned a light. Beautiful idea of course, criticizing you, Rick, about oversimplifying agency and contingency. And I liked that we oftentimes think of agency and contingency, which almost seems to be a really good dichotomy for the whole universe. It's almost like, and I'm looking at it as entropy and free energy is the other component, but they're energy in general. And this is another way that encapsulates the universe nicely. And I wanted to talk about, add on to something Phil was saying. And I want to talk about it with two topics. One, I'm sure I'll have to wait for later, but the first, one is how it relates to entropy cycles. and the other one is how it relates to something called a Markov process, which you talk about. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's basically what you talk about with is a recursive computer program that always looks at the now and is getting certain weighted values for all the different possible choices. And then whatever the best possibilities, it just goes. And it's like what the Bayesian brain is often referred to is this very sophisticated Markov process, but it's always looking from the now, as if we're always looking from the now. And even our memories are still accessing them in the now here. So we're one giant Markov process. And that's a really interesting idea to get into later. But the one that I really liked with Phil, that he was bringing this extra dimensional layer to agency and contingency. Normally we think of like in any given moment, like in the Markov process, you have a certain amount of contingency and a certain amount of agency. I'm at the grocery store and I need to get jam, and there's only one jam. All right, contingency says I'm getting the jam. But I go to the other grocery store and there's 3 choices, now I get a choice. Ironically, I go to the grocery store with 1,000 jams and I'm coming back with 0 jam, right? So in that case, too much a choice is paralysis, right? You can't make a choice. And this is where it relates to entropy cycles. And then contingency and agency works perfectly. And if you look at it in terms of entropy being defined as the numbers of possibilities, what are your possible choices? Like in a game, how many moves do you have? Right? If I have 5 possible moves versus 100,000 moves, one is a low entropy cycle. That's the low entropy is only 5 choices. And the high entropy is I've got 1,000,000 choices. And so in a really low contingency environment, you're actually saying there are a lot of possibilities out there, lots and lots of possibilities. So it's a high entropy environment state. Yet you have someone with agency who has a very fixed sense of whatever they're doing. That is a low entropy object. There's a low entropy person. A person with a lot of agency is in a state of low entropy. And what you see is very interestingly, going back to Phil, is that agency causes one's future contingency. Agency leads to contingency. Once the agency of light, creating the light bulb was invented, right now that's the contingency that we all need electricity to do everything. We can't run without it. That agency became our contingency. So it created a certain amount of order, which limited the possibilities around you, which then limits your agency. So when you have a very, like you were saying, if you have a very strict set of circumstances to abide by, you don't have many choices. You don't have much agency. And so this is an interesting dialectic that's not just in the now, how much agency do I have and how much contingency do I have, but a dialectic, which is essentially that Markov process of how much agency am I going to use now and how much is that going to change my contingency in the future. If I use all of my agency now to destroy the environment around me, right, that's going to create a terrible set of contingencies later. I'm going to have very little entropy in my environment to essentially feed on. And so you have to be careful that, like, and similarly, if you just pure chaos and you don't have any agency, right, this also defeats the so for races going forward, this look at between almost seeing agency as a limited resource or contingency limit based on the health of self. And it's just in a simple summary, we'll say that you see that using agency now creates essentially more contingency later, which creates less agency then, which will eventually lead to entropy decaying, and more choices will eventually come out as the system decays. But as the system decays, once that's happening, like we almost see now in our times, we have a lot less agency because there's been such a certain set of conditions.
Oh, I think he just dropped. We'll have to check. Here he comes.
Connected. I'm sure people tell me.
Hi, are you back?
Testing. Yeah, can you hear me? Sorry, somehow I got disconnected.
Yeah, you dropped off for a moment.
Okay, I can finish up.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, beautiful soliloquy. It's just the simple agency and contingency are in a dialectic like a yin yang. If you have more of one, it causes there to be less of the other, and they oscillate between high values and no values. As you use your agency, you create certain contingencies that then lower your agency later, and back and forth. And it's interesting that I just see it as a relationship in time, that my agency now will actually affect my amount of agency later, and my amount of contingency now will affect my amount of contingency later. And they're in this interplay between back and forth in cycles of high and low, essentially high and low entropy. That's it. That's Ari.
Thank you, Ari. Yeah, it's really interesting. These back and forths and interactions. You sort of taken me to the level which I'm not always at on these talks, but taken me to, we're getting comfortable enough with these dialectics that we can start to talk about the relationships among the dialectics and the interactions among them. Rather than talking about one dialectic at a time, we can see how they intersect each other. And when we do that, we're starting to talk at the level that the Greeks mean when they talk about archai as being, principles, as being fountains of order. Each of these dialectics generates energy and movement and organization. And when they interact with each other, they create pressures so that there's only so many possible viable solutions. And so the intersections of these various dialectics starts to create the architecture of our life and the things that we do and are able to succeed at versus what we fail at. It's really interesting stuff. And as long as we're talking dialectics, I had to put the fourth one on there, which is the Greek concept of cosmos versus chaos, where cosmos is about, are we together able to create a larger organism by acting coherently with each other in a way that's healthy for each of us as individuals, but also healthy for the group. That's the key to Sophrosyne. And the thing that's missing in the modern fake dialectic, the contradiction between order and chaos, where modern forms of order and modern forms of chaos usually both result in what the ancient Greeks would call chaos, where it's the opposite of cosmos. It suffocates out the capacity for symathecy, the capacity to be in a learning relationship with the cosmos. And without that, we can't function like an organism. I mean, this stuff gets really interesting really fast. And when we start to see these dialectics and we start to understand how important they are to the Greeks, it completely changes the way we read Aristotle or Plato or anybody else from that era. So we start to pick up on their keywords, just like what we're doing in the seminar is learning to see Kenneth Smith's keywords. We can start to pick up on the keywords of Thales and Diogenes and Aristotle and the rest of them, and realize how bad our translations are and how much more interesting it is what they're trying to say than what we took them to mean. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, creativity is on my mind in this sense. Uh, I'll start with something very simple. I mean, I always try to obey the system as much as I can, but within a creative process. In other words, somebody asked me, what would you do if you came to a traffic light and it was red? And you looked around, there's no other cars coming around, right? Would you jump the red light? And I said, no, I wouldn't. I would do what's legally right. I would make a right turn, make a U-E, and make another right turn. I'm actually obeying the law in some sense. So that's a simple example of finding a middle way, a way that does not break the law, but on the other hand, is also a creative process that finds a third way. That's a creative process within a very limited situation. As an artist, I'm always looking for ways that I could transform the situation that's given to me because there's always a lot of uncertainty. It could go in a different way. So there's a lot more choices than, turning right and making a U-turn and turning right again. It's like, but in some sense, the creative process, what that creates is in some sense, you're trapped in a system that's happening right now, and you are trying to look for across the horizon, what is the possibility of this thing becoming something else other than you're trapped in the situation as it is? And that's a creative process that allows, in a sense, inventiveness to look into the future across the horizon. And I think into the horizon means it's it's close to being divine because you are proceeding in a dynamic process. rather than trapped within the system. If I had to live my whole life with just say turning right, make a U-turn, turning right again, that would get pretty boring. But this creativity to cross the horizon means that you are always dealing with a dynamic situation of time. And something that's at hand now could be many, many possibilities, which means that you have to learn how to deal with chaos, uncertainty. Uncertainty is the thing that you always have to deal with. Because if you are so structured that you can't deal with possibilities of uncertainty, then you are trapped within a system because you always have to behave the way the structures allows you to do. So as an artist, then you will end up doing the same damn picture. Somebody say, "Hey, that's a good picture." Yeah, it is, but it's like it's so boring. It's the same damn one, you know. I might as well make a plate and create and make a print. So, in some sense, I think that's almost a divine relationship to potentiality. It's not exactly a divine thing, what, God told you about this and that, but you are reaching in the same direction. That has to do with your spirit and your soul, reaching in the soul. And that I think that is something close to being uh, holy in some sense. So I think that is a special gift that human beings have. But on the other hand, I guess if you don't understand that, then you could create awful lot of chaos. You just go the wrong way. You think you see the future, but you actually don't. So I think you have to be willing to live with a great deal of uncertainty, you know, and I think that's the only way to expand your consciousness and your possibilities. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Hey, Donald, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, maybe I can talk about something I know about. If we have the technology now, that if it were applied when Phil came to this stoplight where there was no other traffic and he had a red light, in a more just, we could create a more just world where that never occurred. That the systems monitoring, controlling that light simply said, there's no other traffic, proceed, Phil. You know,
Exactly.
right.
Exactly.
And that might,
Actually, they do have that. That like traffic lights are controlled in such a way that, in a sense, is time oriented, so that usually they
yeah.
structure it in such a way that you could go.
It's usually, time and sensor
Yeah.
controlled, but it could be done. They don't really, there's not a good way to detect you're the only guy there,
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say for Rick, that Moore's law, while it was working, created an awful lot of money in the tech industry.
It sure did.
Because not only did transistor density double, usually the value of companies doubled.
Yes. Yes.
So that was the tech boom of the 90s and the 2000s, up until the big tech bust. All right.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so Phil, I'm not going to come out of retirement to make a just traffic light, but somebody should do it.
Somebody should do it
at a cost that's, well, where I live, they're putting cameras and everything at almost all intersections anyway for other purposes. Not to make them.
That
Not
sounds
to
like
make
China. That sounds like China. I don't like that.
Yeah, it's not there to make a more just world. It's there to make a more extractive government.
Yeah. Well, you don't have to make a just traffic light. You could just make a traffic light. You could do that.
Yeah. They say, as bad as the surveillance might be in China, the most surveilled city in the world is London. The density of cameras to the population size is just shocking. And my wife and I have a weakness for British detective shows. So, we watch a certain number of the shows where, oh, they use those cameras. Like, yep, he went here and then he turned left and then he went to the shop and then he came out and then he went there. It's like, oh, goody. It's good to know that no institution is ever corrupt and no bad person will ever be using that against you. It's like, oh my God. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'll just bring up a point I've brought up in recent times. This is to the heart of our present thing that, well, the Middle Ages, preceding the Middle Ages, they came up with the idea of the absolute God as a remedy for skepticism. The ancient polytheistic gods had failed. They had to, refine all the things. We need a God we can worship. We can't worship those polytheistic gods anymore. We have to create a more perfect God, an absolute God. This is the one that carries the absolute guarantee. I mean, you don't want to work your entire life for salvation and have become worthy of heaven just for a flipping glitch to put you in hell. No, we can't have that. Well, the interesting thing, so you go back to extremely ancient times, they didn't think in absolutes. They say the Greco-Romans didn't like the idea of zero, of nothingness. And people are talking about nothing all the time these days, but they don't seem to understand that nothing isn't a positive concept. If I talk about something, it's a positive. If I talk about a cup of tea, there's something definitely there. I can talk about it. It's a positive. We get the concept of nothingness from negation. We're saying it's not that. Nothing is not a cup of tea. Nothing is not a motor car. It's an absence of everything. This is not a positive concept. We're negating. And, they get the idea, well, we have a space. If we remove all the atoms, we have achieved nothingness because atoms are the only things which exist, right? Did you know that? There is nothing beyond atoms. If we get rid of them all, we have nothing. That's a brilliant move. But did you ever consider that there might be something else?
That isn't atoms. Yes. Yes.
You should point this out. They just don't understand. I was at a meeting, the guy says, well, you've got to understand that the experts know best. That's sort of true most of the time. I think this was the thing Nietzsche was trying to warn about, rationalism. It's not that he was the enemy of rationalism, but he said rationalists think that there's a perfect answer that always works in every circumstance. And he did the Nietzschean turn. He went into Dynamism, that no, we're always struggling with competing forces. We always have the tendency to go too far one way or too far the other way. And we can't nail down that fulcrum. It's not a case where you can nail it and it's definitely there, because we're always dealing with changing circumstances. What will work one day is not the answer for tomorrow. But the rationalists cannot conceive of this because they think there is the one perfect idea for every circumstance or every contingency, maybe. And yes, as you point out, they seem to forget that Nazi Germany was a product of experts. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, we like to think that Nazi Germany was the product of crazy, irrational, emotional, hateful people. We really don't like the idea that it was the most educated, scientifically and technologically advanced country on earth. It was the most modern country. and it's, this is impossible to understand if we think that, rationality is the source of all good things and no bad things, only good things. But if, Hegel warns us, right? He says you got to watch out for that intellect, because
well, they got rid of the absolute God, but they kept the absolute in everything else.
Yes.
The absolute idea, the absolute this, the absolute state, the absolute answer. We're still going with the absolute. We still have a tyranny of the spirit, even after we kick God out.
Yes. Thank you, Stephen. Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
I'm going to be quick with this one. The thing is one of the things about contingency, when we ignore it, we'll point to a time in history and extract the facts that we like, that fit our narratives. And when you pull those facts that fit your narratives, then all of a sudden, you're like, oh, I know exactly what happened in this particular situation, and it completely ignores contingency. So, I mean, it's one of these issues that has, it's not applying a framework with any principles of any sort. You're just making comments. And, this is not totally, we had a conversation recently about Thucydides' trap at work. And, and it's nice. But, you can extract things from particular moments in time and be like, oh, well, this fits my narrative. And I'm going to write a paper about it, and then everybody's going to listen to it. And it's like, well, and then you look a little deeper, and it's like, well, 8 out of 12 times it occurred. Well, I mean, well, then what the hell is that? Like, I mean, so you feel like you've discovered this, way the world works, and it's nothing even close to it. So I think that even, and this comes, back to, I mean, we do have to look at some of the similarities and some of the mistakes that, in history. What are some of the, surrounding, kind of issues and what seem to be the constants with a lot of the mistakes. But you do have to be careful that you just extract it to meet your narrative. And that's just bad analysis.
Thank you, Joe. All right, well, let's finish off my first error. So the punchline goes something like this, right? That we could be responsible for things that we can't help but fail at. In fact, we are responsible for things we can't help but fail at. Some of them we can succeed at, some we can fail at. We don't always know which we can succeed and which we can fail, but it doesn't change the fact that we're responsible, because God knows nobody else wants to take that responsibility. They have their own crap that they're responsible for. And this is where even when I don't have a chance to succeed because I was never offered an example that I could learn from to cultivate my character into a better state. Let me put it this way. Suppose I have anger management problems because that was all the examples I was given. Yeah, that's just bad analysis. Yes. Yeah, suppose I have anger management problems because that's all the example I was ever given. So there's really nothing I could do but react inappropriately when I get angry. Stamp and say, you made me angry. You're the bad man. You need to be punished for making me angry. And all of that's inappropriate, unhealthy behavior. That's not going to help me. It's not going to help us as a group. But I don't really have a choice, because when did I ever get another example? And again, this is analogous to what Kenneth says, which is, how can a modern become an Aristos when there are no examples of Aristoi around us to follow around? And that's the main way you learn about what's possible with an Aristos. And without that, we can't become Aristoi. We can't do it. It's far too complex a thing that you can't learn it from a book. It's not just about abstract intellectualizing. It's about practice. right? Is there an aristocrat in the house? Sadly, in the modern era, everyone's like, oh yes, we're all aristocrats here, especially the guy in the corner picking his nose. He's definitely an aristocrat. So even though we couldn't succeed in that circumstance, the Greeks say we still have a duty to cultivate our character. We have that duty because character is so liable to going wrong that it is incumbent upon us to do everything we can to mitigate the problems of the character that we find ourselves with. I mean, at any point in our life, when we ask ourselves the question about, are we, well, how much should I focus on, dealing with my ethos, with my character? The answer is always, there is always going to be some stuff in there that got in there before you even thought to ask the question. And some of that stuff isn't going to be good stuff. It's going to be unhealthy. So you can be sure you have a freight of unhealthiness. And as we were saying when we were kind of with Phil and Joe and everybody else's help, we're sort of seeing this model is that your agency derives from a contingency. And the contingency is your ethos. Your ethos determines your agency. But in turn, as Phil points out, your agency can change your contingency. So if you direct your agency at your ethos to change it and cultivate it, then you can change the contingency that controls your agency, and you get this feedback loop. So you have to do it. It's your duty. And part of the reason that this matters, and this is where we get to the punchline. When it comes, what is the human condition? What does it mean to be human? I had a discussion Sunday morning with some folks where we were talking about, is man part of nature? Is everything that man does natural because man is part of nature? Is there no such thing as the artificial? And I was arguing, well, of course, that is so reductionist that it destroys one of the most important distinctions that there is in the world. And the distinction is, you never see an acorn deciding that it's going to, get an Uzi and murder a bunch of school kids. That just doesn't ever happen. It's not a roll of the dice. The die will never come up with the number that says, okay, now the acorn has become a menace to the people around it and it's going to, grab a gun and kill people. It can't do it. It has sophrosune, and the sophrosune will not allow it to orient in that direction. A cheetah won't do it either, nor a swordfish. None of them will do it. Only a person can do that. And a person can do that because we lack sophrosune. We do not know where health lies. We are filled with enthusiasms. We are possessed by the, entheos. We're possessed by these daimons that get us enthusiastic about things, and we act on them. And those things that we act on are usually completely divorced from issues of what is healthy and what is not healthy. And so the distinction to make here is I started to make it before, but I didn't actually bring it to the finish line. So let's bring it to the finish line. It goes like this. If you're an acorn, you're probably going to fail, as Stephen points out, because there's millions of you. The oak trees are dropping you all over the place. First of all, most of you will probably be eaten or rot. But even the ones that aren't eaten or rot, you'll end up in the wrong place, on a rock or something, or it's too dry, or it's too wet, or what have you. Contingency is not your friend if you're an acorn. But agency, your agency is your friend, because there is a part of the contingency that is your friend. And the part of the contingency that is your friend is your ethos. Your inner nature, that contingent part of you that determines your agency, that's your friend if you're an acorn. Because it is very rare for there to be genetic errors in an acorn so bad that the acorn won't try to grow into a viable oak. It will always try to, if given the opportunity. It can't control whether the opportunity comes or not, but if the opportunity does come, it will take it. It will seize it. It is always ready. Like the cheetah that cannot take its eyes off the beautiful gazelle, the oak has its eyes on the prize. It always wants to become, the acorn always wants to become an oak. And that goes as far, one of the things that people underestimate, that goes as far as, why does a deciduous tree drop its leaves every year? There's more reasons than we talk about. And one of the reasons is those leaves drop at its feet and terraform the soil. They adjust the pH, they adjust the balance of nitrogen and phosphorus and all the other nutrients that the oak wants to be in the soil at its feet. It's generating its own soil, first as solar collectors, and then turning them into soil to improve its condition. It terraforms its own piece of land to alter the contingency of the nature around it and improve its odds of becoming a successful oak tree. That is how determined the acorn is to become an oak. It does not miss a chance. Human beings have exactly the opposite problem. We are incredibly flexible, and we have the capacity to alter our own ethos. But we don't have any sophrosyne. So we don't know why we should do any of these things. So 999 times out of 1,000, contingency doesn't give the acorn the opportunity. But that one time that it does, the acorn does not miss the opportunity. It puts down its roots and it starts growing. But human beings are in a situation where, because of our adaptability and our malleability, we get far more opportunities from our contingency than the oak tree does. We're generalists. We can thrive in all kinds of different conditions. And yet, that same flexibility has made it that we don't have sophrosyne, which means even though we succeed far more, even though we get opportunities to succeed, viable opportunities, far more than 999 times out of 1,000. I mean, far more than 1 out of 1,000, right? Far more than 1 out of 1,000 we get a chance to succeed. But all those extra opportunities are wasted on us because it's our own ethos that fucks us up, so that when the opportunity comes along, we don't take it. I was playing video games. I was arguing with my dad. I took a nap. I was doing anything but what was right for me in that moment. When Kairos is defined to mean season, but it also means the time that's different from other times. The time when your agency matters. The time when if you act now, there's plenty of times when if you act, it won't make a difference because the contingency isn't with you. But when the contingency is with you, and this is the time to act, that's Kairos. And the problem with Homo sapiens is so often we either don't act or we do the wrong thing. The Kairos is there. Nature's given us the shot. We could have made the basket, but we're too busy pushing the guy next to us. We weren't even looking in the right direction. This distinguishes Homo sapiens from other life forms. And this distinction goes right to the heart of the natural versus the artificial. Things that are natural are ruled by sophrosyne. They have ethoi that are highly saturated with sophrosyne, that point them in the direction of health and vitality. But Homo sapiens lacks sophrosyne, which means even though we get far more opportunities, we waste far more opportunities. And that's why it's a moral issue. The duty and the responsibility to cultivate your character, to make the kind of character that will make you pay attention, to simulate sophrosyne as best you can, so you pay attention to the things that would be healthy for you to do, so that when those opportunities come along, you're capable of acting and doing the right thing. That requires cultivation. Otherwise, we're just going to be like those acorns, and most of us are going to fail. But not fail because of contingency. We'll fail because of our own responsibilities, because of our own ethos. That was the thing that I wanted to add 2 weeks ago. But when I started to introduce the thing, I was originally thinking it'd be a sentence or two, and immediately my brain log jammed because as you see, it actually took an hour and a half to get through. So this is not sometimes the pig and the python happens and we choke, and that was what happened. So I want to at this point I want to quote George Bernard Shaw, because Kenneth Smith loves this George Bernard Shaw quote, and he gets it right every time. It's Shaw, who said, "Except for his first 9 months, no man manages affairs half so well as a tree does." Thus, Homo sapiens versus the acorn. This is our discussion. It's not a dialectic. It's just an unflattering comparison. And this is why the Greeks were obsessed with anthropoculture. What is culture for, if not to do everything in your power, to use every trick in the book, to stack the deck in the favor of Homo sapiens developing a good ethos that allows us to simulate sophrosyne, so that when those opportunities, those multiple opportunities pass us because of contingency and our flexibility, we can actually act correctly in some of them. Because that's how a civilization survives. That's the Greek recipe for how to do it, in a nutshell. And so wasting religion and art and politics and economics on anything other than cultivating and maximizing sophrosyne is just, the Greeks considered it idiotic. I mean, fatally idiotic. Like, that's a civilization that doesn't want to exist. If I use my gifts to rip off Phil, Instead of to help us both have better character and be more able to act in the world, I'm a fucking idiot, say the Greeks. I'm so obsessed with my own short-term goals that I'm missing the big picture. And the big picture is what matters to the Greeks. So agency versus contingency. This was what I wanted to add 2 weeks ago. And it was my mistake that all of that just fell out of my brain between one word and the next. If you go back and watch the video, which David sent me the link to, it is hilarious. I'm so passionate, enthusiastic. Everybody's listening, and I go, and then, and that was it. That was the end of my sentence. It just trailed off, and I completely lost it because I'm immortal. God bless human beings. All right, well, we've got 14, 15 minutes left. My other 2 errors are much simpler. They don't require that much discussion. So let's dispense with them. The second error is, and I said this before a little bit, but I really want to underscore it. I was wrong and Stephen was right. I was wrong when I said that the ancient world had no real concept of science. They had reason and persuasion, but they didn't have empirical testing to check, to leash your ideas. That was what I said. I said it took the Arab and Persian, the Muslim scholars of the medieval period to discover the limits and liabilities of the Greek and Roman inheritance in literature and discover how many of the persuasive tracts were just bullshit when they put them to the test. And so they invented the idea of the empirical method, the scientific method. This was what I said. And Stephen said, that's not right. He said the Arabs rediscovered it and that it had already been there. And I said, that's not true. Well, I was wrong. And there are a pair of books written by Richard Carrier, and anybody who wants to can pick themselves up a copy. They are very interesting reading. I have read excerpts, and I'm looking forward to reading the whole thing. The first one is called The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire. The second one is called Science Education in the Early Roman Empire. They're both by Richard Carrier. And his premise is as follows. He says, if you translate Aristotle correctly, which nobody does, but if you translate him correctly, you see that he lays out almost all the parts of the scientific method correctly. He did not say, set me up as an idol for the next 1,000 years of the medieval church and don't assume that everything I said is God's own truth. He absolutely did not say any of that. He said you have to look at nature, kata fuse, according to nature what is happening. That's more important than according to opinion or according to rational argument or persuasion or anything else. None of those other sources of information are interesting, but you have to always check with nature. There's some 1 or 2 pieces of the scientific method that he's missing, but his own students figured it out. They can, in the next 2 generations, they continued developing Aristotle's method until by the 2nd generation after Aristotle, according to Richard Carrier, what those students are espousing at the Lyceum is indistinguishable in most essentials from the modern scientific method. And that then continues on until the end of the Republic and the early Roman Empire. That there are many people practicing, it's not the only school around, but that there are many people practicing the early scientific method until the early Roman Empire. At which point, of course, everything starts to go wrong with the growth of corruption and too much power, too much order, suffocating the life out of the ancient world until it has to be overthrown by the medievals. Carrier has very, very critical things to say about the medieval Christian church as basically killing what was an astonishing kind of level of rapid development in science up until that freeze happened. And he argues that we could have had all the things we associate with the modern scientific world 500 years or more earlier than we did if it weren't for that dark age. This is where the Renaissance people were at, by the way. They said the same thing, but I subscribe to some historians who said that critique was overblown, and that in fact they didn't really have science in the ancient world, and it was developed in the medieval world, and the medieval world represented progress over the ancient world, blah blah blah. And he's like, no, the evidence actually shows it was right to call it a dark age, not because it was uniformly ignorant. I mean, important advances did occur, but because they set back science so hard in favor of dogma and orthodoxy, the central folks. So mea culpa, I was wrong. Anybody who watches the earlier videos and is persuaded by me about the ancient world, just know that To err is human. And as a student, I'm going to get some stuff wrong. So that's the second error. The third error, we can finish this one off too. I talked a few months ago about a book called Creating Christ. And Creating Christ postulated that the Flavian emperors, as part of their campaign to conquer Judea, also nurtured the little upstart sect of Christians and gave them protection and wrote or co-wrote the Gospels to try to pull the stinger out of the revolutionary Jewish people who were trying to overthrow, the Roman domination of their lands, and instead offer a Roman approved version of Judaism that was about peace and love and turning the other cheek and paying your taxes. That's the premise of Creating Christ. And that premise had been stated before by other people going all the way back to 19th century. There was a German author who first postulated this. But the Creating Christ guys, they came out with their book a few years ago and they really pushed it hard. And it's persuasively written, but it turns out it's really bad history. And I read a takedown by a historian who went through point by point all of the pieces of bad history that are in that book. And I will just cite two of them. There are methodological flaws, there are errors, and there are just clear self-deceptions in it as well. And the first is, one of their key pieces of evidence is they say the Flavian emperors had a symbol that was an anchor with a dolphin swimming around it in a spiral. And that Flavian symbol, shows their blessing or approval, and that it's found in old catacombs where Christians buried their dead. And it shows that the Flavian emperors were sponsoring, the Christians and protecting them. That's one of their pieces of evidence. And as the historian points out, their key piece of justification that this is actually a Flavian symbol is that the Flavians issued Roman coins that had the symbol on it. Right? You're like, well, that's interesting. Maybe that's evidence that the argument is true. It says, but the historian says, no, that's not the only thing they issued. They issued 12 sets of coins, one for each of the gods of Olympus. And the anchor and the dolphin was the symbol of Poseidon, not the symbol of the Flavians. But what these guys did is they cherry picked the one coin issued that seemed to back up their argument, and they ignored 11/12 of the evidence, because there's no way the Owl of Minerva could be taken as a symbol of the Flavian emperors, or Zeus's thunderbolt. That didn't look like it either. They're doing what Dan Brown does in the Da Vinci Code. They're really cherry picking which piece of the evidence that they want, and it's bad history. He says, but this historian says the other part that is the most clear refutation is the idea that the Romans routinely used religion to manipulate conquered peoples. He says there is absolutely no evidence of that. He says the way that the Romans manipulated conquered peoples was by sending in armies and beating the crap out of them. So that's what they did in Judea. Famously, that's what they did in Judea. They marched in armies and beat the crap out of the Jewish people, and then they did it again and took down their temple, and that was the end of the temple era. In fact, as the historian points out, there's case after case in Roman history where if the Romans had been as sophisticated as the authors of Creating Christ claimed, the Roman Empire would have survived for centuries longer than it did. It was because of their just thuggish brutality, because they were the mafia empire, that they made everybody pissed off at them. I mean, they united the whole world against them. They were so punched to the face kind of rulers. If you were a centurion and you disobeyed orders, it wasn't just you that was killed. They also killed your entire family. It was very much like the mafia. I mean, everybody who fought in the Roman Empire was essentially, a blackmail victim. Fight for us or else. They got paid sometimes, but they also were all being blackmailed all the time. It was very thuggy. These are not sophisticated people manipulating people's religious beliefs in order to get them to join the Roman Empire. This is join us or we'll punch you in the face kind of stuff. So
I mean, can you compare the Roman Empire, the Colosseum? What were those the gladiators fighting until death? I mean, can you think of any other civilization, any other, ancient civilizations did anything like that? The Romans are the only ones, right?
Well,
Did Greeks have something like that?
It's hard to say, because the Roman influence was so wide that lots of other people picked it up after they did. I mean, you can look at things like the chariot races in Byzantium, which were pretty brutal. I mean, to be, Ben-Hur is not wrong. Those chariot races were pretty brutal. And blood sports have a long history with empires. I believe it is claimed that either the Mayas or the Aztecs had a version of basketball where the losers were executed, and so they're fighting for their life in the arena for. Now I don't know if that's true, right? That might be more Cortez bullshit, but that was, at least when I was a kid, that was the standard historical perspective on that. But you're right that there's plenty of places around the world where people didn't have that level of blood sports. The Romans were just particularly, oh, you want to have a good time? Let's go watch some people stab each other with sharpened bars of steel. That'll be fun. Yeah. So he's saying, basically the reason that a book like the historian says the reason a book like Creating Christ appeals to us is that we're rife with conspiracies, right? I mean, public relations is an entire industry. Advertising is an entire industry. There's people are constantly trying to figure out how to persuade us of things. It's why Noam Chomsky and Bernard Herrmann wrote, not Bernard Herrmann, Herman, I can't remember, I guess his last name's Herman, wrote Manufacturing Consent, looking at the extent to which we mobilize our media to persuade people of things, persuading people and trying not to use the punch in the fist in the face is core to how the modern world is organized. When we have to deploy the National Guard or the police or the army, it represents, the more sophisticated rulers among us consider it a failure. We were clumsy. We weren't, you don't want to show that people are ruled by force. You want to convince them to do it themselves. But the Romans just weren't like that. They're like, shut up and do it, or I'll stab you with this sword. And it's why when Mark Antony didn't like what Cicero said, he sent a guy over to stab him with a sword. That was his idea of a debate. It's like, let's just kill you. It's simpler.
My actor friend John Turturro, big movie star, he's so like pro Italy, Roman, oh, if it weren't for the Italians, we would not have the bridges and buildings and all that, the architecture. And so, yeah. At the other end, they were very creative in that regard, I guess.
Life of Brian has that great dialogue about what have the Romans ever done for us? Yes. So I guess the upshot of this about Creating Christ is as follows. History is a science, like other sciences, or it is at least an art. It is a discipline. And it can be impossible to, if you're not a professional historian, it can be impossible to judge whether a persuasive argument is true or not. All you can judge is whether it's persuasive. To judge whether it's true, you need a historian to come in and say, here's the rest of the evidence they didn't give you. It's like, it all sounds, ceteris paribus, all else being equal. Yeah, maybe it would be true, but ceteris is not paribus. Instead, there's all this other evidence that's out there that's been ignored. Cherry picking is so easy to do when people have an axe to grind. And as long as they don't tell you that they've been cherry picking, it's easy to come away thinking that they've given you the whole picture when they've done nothing of the sort. And you can make a picture say the exact opposite of what it is just by cherry picking which parts of it you show to somebody. It's a gift, and people are very good at it. So I have a duty while I'm explicating this text that Kenneth Smith has written for us to also explicate my own errors and show philosophy in action, which is, you want to use it against yourself. This is me using it against 3 major errors on my part and 1 small mistake on Kenneth's part. That's today's that's today's session, our interlude before chapter 7. I hope are you not entertained? Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Just one more, just keep this one in mind. I have mentioned it before. But the Greeks didn't invent everything. They were getting their ideas from the humble Egyptians and the Babylonians, the Axial Age Babylonians, the Neo-Assyrians. They weren't calling them the Neo-Babylonians for nothing. These were new Babylonians. They weren't the Babylonians of 1,000 years ago. These were people that were laying the basis for philosophy. for invention. A lot of the ideas that came to Greece weren't invented by the Greeks. They were just a very nice blank page to insert the ideas and watch them grow in a way they wouldn't in the Middle East. As you know, the parable of the sower, the ideas had found the good earth where it would spring up. We see this repeat itself again in the modern, well, what became the moderns, the Nordics. The Nordics were just barbarians. They did come up with a few ideas themselves, but they gained the advantage of everything the Greeks and the Romans had. They were the blank sheet of paper that these new ideas could work on in a way they couldn't in the other cultures, where the cares of the world were dominating. You went to Italy, yeah, the Italians are pretty smart. They were also full of concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
So, yeah, well, I would say, yeah, if you want to look for where modern Western civilization started, yeah, I'm adding something, look to the Franks' conversion to Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good stuff. I guess my final comment for today would be there's so much of the modern world that teaches us that to be wrong is dangerous, but not nearly as dangerous as admitting that you're wrong. And you're supposed to be sad when you find out that you're wrong about something. You're supposed to deny it and fight back against it and defend your beliefs and rationalize them, cherry pick more evidence that can shore up your beliefs. And you can always tell a crank, because a crank is somebody who that's exactly what they'll do when they're confronted with evidence that they're wrong. They'll instead push back and collect more evidence to try to shore up the sagging wall of their cathedral of beliefs. But the core of philosophy is that it can be, and Nietzsche talks about this, it can be a joyous thing to unshackle yourself from the bullshit in your mind, right? The truth is out there. The truth is not in here. In here is all this stuff that got in there before I ever started being truthy, before I ever started learning how to tell the difference between truth and falsehood. And so it's by clearing this stuff out, I create room to breathe. And that's core to philosophy. You know, he was permitted to attain the Archimedean standpoint on the condition that he use it against himself. This is what it's for. And it can be a great joy, a great pleasure to say, I mean, what a breath of relief. I can let go of that bullshit and, and embrace better ideas, open myself to new things. It's invigorating. I think that when people ask, why should I study philosophy? I think for me, a big part of it is that it feels great to shed your old skin and say goodbye to you. I'm on to greener pastures. So thanks, everybody. I guess we'll wrap up here for this week.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you.
Bye, Rick.
Bye.